Section 24 of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Kati, Gurnee, Illinois. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers, by Catherine Crowe. Chapter 16, The Poltergeist of the Germans, and Possession, Part 1. With regard to the so-called hauntings, referred to in the preceding chapter, there seems reason to believe that the invisible guest was formerly a dweller upon earth, in the flesh, who is prevented by some circumstance which we are not qualified to explain, from pursuing the destiny of the human race, by entering freely into the next state prepared for him. He is like an unfortunate caterpillar that cannot entirely free itself from the integuments of its reptile life which chain it to the earth, while its fluttering wings vainly seek to bear it into the region to which it now belongs. But there is another kind of haunting, which is still more mysterious and strange, though by no means unfrequent, and which, from the odd, sportive, mischievous nature of the disturbances created, one can scarcely reconcile to our notions of what we understand by the term ghost. For in those cases where the unseen visitant appears to be the spirit of a person deceased, we see evidences of grief, remorse, and dissatisfaction, together with, in many instances, a disposition to repeat the acts of life, or at least to simulate a repetition of them. But there is nothing sportive or mischievous, nor, except where an injunction is disobeyed or a request refused, are there generally any evidences of anger or malignity. But in the other cases alluded to, the annoyances appear rather like the tricks of a mischievous imp. I refer to what the Germans call the Poltergeist, or racketing spectre, for the phenomenon is known in all countries, and has been known in all ages. Since hearing of the phenomenon of the electric girl, which attracted so much attention and occasioned so much controversy in Paris lately, and other similar cases which have since reached me, I feel doubtful whether some of these strange circumstances may not have been connected with electricity in one form or another. The famous story of what is familiarly called the Stockwell ghost, for example, might possibly be brought under this category. I have heard some people assert that the mystery of this affair was subsequently explained away, and the whole found to be a trick. But that is a mistake. Some years ago I was acquainted with persons whose parents were living on the spot at that time, who knew all the details, and to them it remained as great a mystery as ever. Not the slightest light had ever been thrown upon it. People are so glad to get rid of troublesome mysteries of this description that they are always ready to say, "The trick has been found out," and those who pride themselves on not believing idle stories are to the last degree credulous when the idle story flatters their skepticism. The circumstances of the so-called Stockwell ghost, which I extract from a report published at the time, are as follows. The pamphlet was entitled An Authentic, Candid, and Circumstantial Narrative of the Astonishing Transactions at Stockwell, in the County of Surrey, on Monday and Tuesday, the 6th and 7th days of January, 1772, containing a series of the most surprising and unaccountable events that ever happened, which continued, from first to last, upward of 20 hours, and at different places, published with the consent and approbation of the family and other parties concerned, to authenticate which the original copy is signed by them. Before we enter upon a description of the most extraordinary transactions that perhaps ever happened, We shall begin with an account of the parties who were principally concerned, and, in justice to them, give their characters, by which means the impartial world may see what credit is due to the following narrative. The events, indeed, are of so strange and singular a nature, that we cannot be at all surprised the public should be doubtful of the truth of them, more especially as there have been too many impositions of this sort. But, let us consider, here are no sinister ends to be answered, no contributions to be wished for, nor would be accepted, as the parties are in reputable situations and good circumstances, particularly Mrs. Golding, who is a lady of an independent fortune. Richard Fowler and his wife might be looked upon as an exception to this assertion, but as their loss was trivial, they must be left out of the question, except so far as they appear corroborating evidences. Mr. Paine's maid lost nothing. How or by what means these transactions were brought about has never transpired. We have only to rest our confidence on the veracity of the parties, whose descriptions have been most strictly attended to, without the least deviation. Nothing here offered is either exaggerated or diminished. The whole stated in the clearest manner, just as they occurred. As such, only we lay them before the candid and impartial public. Mrs. Golding, an elderly lady at Stockwell, in Surrey, at whose house the transactions began, was born in the same parish, Lambeth, has lived in it ever since, and has always been well known and respected as a gentlewoman of unblemished honor and character. Mrs. Paine, a niece of Mrs. Golding, has been married several years to Mr. Paine, a farmer, at Brixton Causeway, a little above Mr. Angel's, has several children, and is well known and respected in the parish. Mary Martin, Mr. Paine's servant, an elderly woman, has lived 2 years with them and 4 years with Mrs. Golding, where she came from. Richard Fowler lives almost opposite to Mr. Paine at the Brick Pound, an honest, industrious, and sober man, and Sarah Fowler, wife to the above, is an industrious and sober woman. These are the subscribing evidences that we must rest the truth of the facts upon. Yet there are numbers of other persons who were eyewitnesses of many of the transactions during the time they happened, all of whom must acknowledge the truth of them. Another person who bore a principal part of these scenes was Anne Robinson, Mrs. Golding's maid, a young woman about 20 years old, who had lived with her but 1 week and 3 days. So much for the historiae personae, and now for the narrative. On Monday, January the 6th, 1772, about 10 o'clock in the forenoon, as Mrs. Golding was in her parlor, she heard the china and glasses in the back kitchen tumble down and break. Her maid came to her, and told her the stone plates were falling from the shelf. Mrs. Golding went into the kitchen and saw them broke. Presently after, a row of plates from the next shelf fell down likewise, while she was there, and nobody near them. This astonished her much, and while she was thinking about it, other things in different places began to tumble about, some of them breaking, attended with violent noises all over the house. A clock tumbled down, and the case broke. A lantern that hung on the staircase was thrown down, and the glass broken to pieces. An earthen pan of salted beef broke to pieces, and the beef fell about. All this increased her surprise, and brought several persons about her, among whom was Mr. Rowledge, a carpenter, who gave it as his opinion that the foundation was giving way and that the house was tumbling down, occasioned by the too great weight of an additional room erected above. So ready are we to discover natural causes for everything. But no such thing happened, as the reader will find, For whatever was the cause, that caused ceased almost as soon as Mrs. Golding and her maid left any place, and followed them wherever they went. Mrs. Golding ran into Mr. Gresham's house, a gentleman living next door to her, where she fainted. In the interim, Mr. Rowledge and other persons were removing Mrs. Golding's effects from her house, for fear of the consequences he had prognosticated. At this time all was quiet. Mrs. Golding's maid, remaining in the house, was gone upstairs, and when called upon several times to come down, for fear of the dangerous situation she was thought to be in, she answered very coolly, and after some time came down as deliberately, without any seeming fearful apprehensions. Mrs. Payne was sent for from Brixton Causeway, and desired to come directly, as her aunt was supposed to be dead. This was the message to her. When Mrs. Payne came, Mrs. Golding was come to herself, but very faint. Among the persons who were present was Mr. Gardner, a surgeon of Clapham, whom Mrs. Payne desired to bleed her aunt, which he did. Mrs. Payne asked him if the blood should be thrown away. He desired it might not, as he would examine it when cold. These minute particulars would not be taken notice of, but as a chain to what follows. For the next circumstance is of a more astonishing nature than anything that had preceded it. The blood that was just congealed sprang out of the basin upon the floor, and presently after the basin broke to pieces. This china basin was the only thing broke belonging to Mr. Gresham. A bottle of rum that stood by it broke at the same time. Among the things that were removed to Mr. Gresham's was a tray full of china, a Japan bread-basket, some mahogany waiters, and some bottles of liquors, jars of pickles, etc., and a pier-glass, which was taken down by Mr. Saville, a neighbor of Mrs. Golding's. He gave it to one Robert Hames, who laid it on the grass-plat at Mr. Gresham's, but, before he could put it out of his hands, some parts of the frame on each side flew off. It rained at that time. Mrs. Golding desired it might be brought into the parlor, where it was put under a sideboard, and a dressing-glass along with it. It had not been there long, before the glasses in china, which stood on the sideboard, began to tumble about and fall down, and broke both the glasses to pieces. Mr. Saville and others, being asked to drink a glass of wine or rum, both the bottles broke in pieces before they were uncorked. Mrs. Golding's surprise and fear increasing, she did not know what to do, or where to go. Wherever she and her maid were, these strange, destructive circumstances followed her, and how to help or free herself from them was not in her power, or any other person's present. Her mind was one confused chaos, lost to herself and everything about her, drove from her own home, and afraid there would be no other to receive her. At last she left Mr. Gresham's, and went to Mr. Mayling's, a gentleman at the next door. Here she stayed about 3/4 of an hour, during which time nothing happened. Her maid stayed at Mr. Gresham's, to put up what few things remained unbroken of her mistress's, in a back apartment, when a jar of pickles that stood upon a table turned upside down. Then a jar of raspberry jam broke to pieces. Next, 2 mahogany waiters and a quadrille box likewise broke in pieces. Mrs. Payne, not choosing her aunt should stay too long at Mr. Mayling's, for fear of being troublesome, persuaded her to go to her house at Rush Common, near Brixton Causeway, where she would endeavor to make her as happy as she could, hoping by this time all was over, as nothing had happened at that gentleman's house while she was there. This was about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. Mr. and Miss Gresham were at Mr. Payne's house, when Mrs. Payne, Mrs. Golding, and her maid went there. It being about dinner time, they all dined together. In the interim, Mrs. Golding's servant was sent to her house to see how things remained. When she returned, she told them nothing had happened since they left it. Some time after, Mr. Gresham and Miss went home, everything remaining quiet at Mr. Payne's. But about 8 o'clock in the evening, a fresh scene began. The first thing that happened was, a whole row of pewter dishes, except one, fell from off a shelf to the middle of the floor, rolled about a little while, then settled, and, what is almost beyond belief, as soon as they were quiet, turned upside down. They were then put on the dresser, and went through the same a second time. Next fell a whole row of pewter plates from off the second shelf over the dresser to the ground, and being taken up and put on the dresser one in another, they were thrown down again. The next thing was, 2 eggs that were upon one of the pewter shelves, one of them flew off, crossed the kitchen, struck a cat on the head, and then broke in pieces. Next, Mary Martin, Mrs. Payne's servant, went to stir the kitchen fire. She got to the right-hand side of it, being a large chimney, as is usual in farmhouses. A pestle and mortar that stood near the left-hand end of the chimney shelf jumped about 6 feet on the floor. Then went candlesticks and other brasses, scarcely anything remaining in its place. After this, the glasses and china were put down on the floor for fear of undergoing the same fate. They presently began to dance and tumble about, and then broke to pieces. A teapot that was among them flew to Mrs. Golding's maid's foot, and struck it. A glass tumbler that was put on the floor jumped about 2 feet, and then broke. Another that stood by it jumped about at the same time, but did not break till some hours after, when it jumped again, and then broke. A china bowl that stood in the parlor jumped from the floor to behind a table that stood there. This was most astonishing, as the distance from where it stood was between 7 and 8 feet, but was not broke. It was put back by Richard Fowler to its place, where it remained for some time, and then flew to pieces. The next thing that followed was a mustard pot, that jumped out of a closet and was broke. A single cup that stood upon the table, almost the only thing remaining, jumped up, flew across the kitchen, ringing like a bell, and then was dashed to pieces against the dresser. A candlestick that stood on the chimney shelf flew across the kitchen to the parlor door, at about 15 feet distance. A tea kettle, under the dresser, was thrown out about 2 feet. Another kettle, that stood at one end of the range, was thrown against the iron that is fixed to prevent children from falling into the fire. A tumbler with rum and water in it, that stood upon a waiter upon a table in the parlor, jumped about 10 feet, and was broke. The table then fell down, and along with it a silver tankard belonging to Mrs. Golding, the waiter in which stood the tumbler and a candlestick. A case bottle then flew to pieces. The next circumstance was, a ham that hung in one side of the kitchen chimney raised itself from the hook and fell down to the ground. Some time after, another ham that hung on the other side of the chimney likewise underwent the same fate. Then a flitch of bacon, which hung up in the same chimney, fell down. All the family were eye-witnesses to these circumstances, as well as other persons, some of whom were so alarmed and shocked that they could not bear to stay, and were happy in getting away, though the unhappy family were left in the midst of their distresses. Most of the genteel families around were continually sending to inquire after them, and whether all was over or not. Is it not surprising that some among them had not the inclination and resolution to try to unravel this most intricate affair, at a time when it would have been in their power to have done so? There certainly was sufficient time for so doing, as the whole, from first to last, continued upward of 20 hours. At all the times of action, Mrs. Golding's servant was walking backward and forward in either the kitchen or parlor, or wherever some of the family happened to be. Nor could they get her to sit down 5 minutes together, except at one point, for about half an hour toward the morning, when the family were at prayers in the parlor. Then all was quiet. But in the midst of the greatest confusion, she was as much composed as at any other time, and with uncommon coolness of temper, advised her mistress not to be alarmed or uneasy, as she said these things could not be helped. Thus she argued, as if they were common occurrences, which must happen in every family. This advice surprised and startled her mistress, almost as much as the circumstances that occasioned it. For how can we suppose that a girl of about 20 years old, an age when female timidity is too often assisted by superstition, could remain in the midst of such calamitous circumstances, except they proceed from causes best known to herself, and not be struck with the same terror as every other person was who was present? These reflections led Mr. Paine, and, at the end of the transactions, likewise Mrs. Golding, to think that she was not altogether so unconcerned as she appeared to be, but, hitherto, the whole remains mysterious and unrivaled. About 10 o'clock at night, they sent over the way to Richard Fowler, to desire he would come and stay with them. He came and continued till 1 in the morning, and was so terrified that he could remain no longer. As Mrs. Golding could not be persuaded to go to bed, Mrs. Paine, at that time, 1 o'clock, made an excuse to go upstairs to her youngest child, under pretense of getting it to sleep. But she really acknowledges it was through fear, as she declares she could not sit up to see such strange things going on, as everything, one after another, was broke, till there was not above 2 or 3 cups and saucers remaining out of a considerable quantity of china, which was destroyed to the amount of some pounds. About 5 o'clock on Tuesday morning, Mrs. Golding went up to her niece, and desired her to get up, as the noises and destruction were so great. She could continue in the house no longer. At this time all the tables, chairs, drawers, etc., were tumbling about. When Mrs. Paine came down, it was amazing beyond all description. Their only security then was to quit the house, for fear of the same catastrophe as had been expected the morning before at Mrs. Golding's. In consequence of this resolution, Mrs. Golding and her maid went over the way to Richard Fowler's. When Mrs. Golding's maid had seen her safe to Richard Fowler's, she came back to Mrs. Paine, to help her to dress the children in the barn, where she had carried them for fear of the house falling. At this time all was quiet. They then went to Fowler's, and then began the same scene as had happened at the other places. It must be remarked, all was quiet here, as well as elsewhere, till the maid returned. When they got to Mr. Fowler's, he began to light a fire in his back room. When done, he put the candle and candlestick upon a table in the foreroom. This apartment Mrs. Golding and her maid had passed through. Another candlestick, with a tin lamp in it, that stood by it, were both dashed together, and fell to the ground. A lantern, with which Mrs. Golding was lighted across the road, sprang from a hook to the ground, and a quantity of oil spilled on the floor. The last thing was the basket of coals tumbled over, the coals rolling about the room. The maid then desired Richard Fowler not to let her mistress remain there, as she said wherever she was the same things would follow. In consequence of this advice, and fearing greater losses to himself, he desired she would quit his house, but first begged her to consider within herself, for her own and the public's sake, whether or not she had been guilty of some atrocious crime, for which Providence was determined to pursue her on this side of the grave. For he could not help thinking she was the object that was to be made an example to posterity, by the all-seeing eye of Providence, 4 crimes which but too often none but that Providence can penetrate, and by such means as these bring to light. Thus was the poor gentlewoman's measure of affliction complete, not only to have undergone all which has been related, but to have added to it the character of a bad and wicked woman, when till this time she was esteemed as a most deserving person. In candor to Fowler, he could not be blamed. What could he do? What would any man have done that was so circumstanced? Mrs. Golding soon satisfied him. She told him she would not stay in his house, or any other person's, as her conscience was quite clear, and she could as well wait the will of Providence in her own house as in any other place whatever, upon which she and her maid went home. Mr. Payne went with them. After they had got to Mrs. Golding's the last time, the same transactions once more began upon the remains that were left. A 9-gallon cask of beer that was in the cellar, the door being open, and no person near it, turned upside down. A pail of water that stood on the floor boiled like a pot. A box of candles fell from a shelf in the kitchen to the floor. They rolled out, but none were broke, and a round mahogany table overset in the parlor. Mr. Payne then desired Mrs. Golding to send her maid for his wife to come to them. When she was gone, all was quiet. Upon her return, she was immediately discharged, and no disturbances have happened since. This was between 6 and 7 o'clock on Tuesday morning. At Mrs. Golding's were broke the quantities of 3 pailfuls of glass, china, etc. At Mrs. Payne's they filled 2 pails. Thus ends the narrative, a true, circumstantial, and faithful account, of which we have laid before the public, and have endeavored, as much as possible, throughout the whole, to state only facts, without presuming to obtrude any opinion on them. If we have in part hinted anything that may appear unfavorable to the girl, it is not from a determination to charge her with the cause, right or wrong, but only from a strict adherence to truth, most sincerely wishing this extraordinary affair may be unraveled. The above narrative is absolutely and strictly true, in witness whereof we have set our hands this 11th day of January, 1772, Mary Golding, John Payne, Mary Payne, Richard Fowler, Sarah Fowler, Mary Martin. The original copy of this narrative, signed as above, with the party's own hands, was put into the hands of Mr. Marks, bookseller, in St. Martin's Lane, to satisfy persons who choose to inspect the same. Such phenomena as this of the Stockwell ghost are by no means uncommon, and I am acquainted with many more instances than I can allude to here. One occurred very lately in the neighborhood of London, as I learned from the following newspaper paragraph. I subsequently heard that the little girl had been sent away, but whether the phenomena then ceased, or whether she carried the disturbance with her, I have not been able to ascertain, nor does it appear certain that she had anything to do with it. A mischievous and mysterious ghost, from a correspondent. The whole of the neighborhood of Black Lion Lane, Bayswater, is ringing with the extraordinary occurrences that have recently happened in the house of a Mr. Williams, on the Moscow road, in which bear a strong resemblance to the celebrated Stockwell ghost affair in 1772. The house is inhabited by Mr. and Mrs. Williams, a grown-up son and daughter, and a little girl between 10 and 11 years of age. On the first day, the family, who are remarkable for their piety, were startled all at once by a mysterious movement among the things in the sitting rooms and kitchen, and other parts of the house. At one time, without any visible agency, one of the jugs came off the hook over the dresser and was broken. Then followed another, and next day another. A china teapot, with the tea just made in it, and placed on the mantelpiece, whisked off onto the floor, and was smashed. A pewter one, which had been substituted immediately after, did the same, and when put on the table, was seen to hop about as if bewitched, and was actually held down while the tea was made for Mr. William's breakfast, before leaving for his place of business. When for a time all had been quiet, off came from its place on the wall a picture in a heavy gilt frame and fell to the floor without being broken. All was now amazement and terror, for the old people are very superstitious, and ascribing it to a supernatural agency, the other pictures were removed and stowed away on the floor. But the spirit of locomotion was not to be arrested. Jugs and plates continued at intervals to quit their posts and skip off their hooks and shelves into the middle of the room, as though they were inspired by the magic flute, and at supper, when the little girl's mug was filled with beer, the mug slided off the table onto the floor. 3 times it was replaced, and 3 times it moved off again. It would be tedious to relate the fantastic tricks which have been played by household articles of every kind. An Egyptian vase jumped off the table suddenly, when no soul was near, and was smashed to pieces. The tea kettle popped off the fire into the grate as Mr. Williams had filled the teapot, which fell off the chimney-piece. Candlesticks, after a dance on the table, flew off, and ornaments from the shelves, and bonnets, and cap-boxes flung about in the oddest manner. A looking-glass hopped off a dressing-table, followed by combs and brushes and several bottles, and a great pincushion has been remarkably conspicuous for its incessant jigs from one part to another. The little girl, who is a Spaniard, and under the care of Mr. and Mrs. Williams, is supposed by their friends to be the cause of it all, however extraordinary it may seem in one of her age, but up to the present time it continues a mystery, and the modus operandi is invisible. Morning Post. To imagine that these extraordinary effects were produced by the voluntary agency of the child furnishes one of those remarkable instances of the credulity of the skeptical to which I have referred. But when we read a true statement of the effects involuntarily exhibited by Angelique Cottin, we began to see that it is just possible the other strange phenomena may be provided by a similar agency. The French Academy of Sciences had determined, as they had formerly done by mesmerism, that the thing should not be true. Monsieur Arago was nonsuited, but although it is extremely possible that either the phenomenon had run its course and arrived at a natural termination, or that the removal of the girl to Paris had extinguished it, there appears no doubt that it had previously existed. Angelique Cottin was a native of La Perriere, aged 14, when, on the 15th of January, 1846, at 8 o'clock in the evening, while wearing silk gloves at an oaken frame, in company with other girls, the frame began to jerk, and they could not by any efforts keep it steady. It seemed as if it were alive, and becoming alarmed, they called in the neighbors, who would not believe them, but desired them to sit down and go on with their work. Being timid, they went one by one, and the frame remained still till Angelique approached, when it recommenced its movements, while she was also attracted by the frame. Thinking she was bewitched or possessed, her parents took her to the presbytery, that the spirit might be exorcised. The curate, however, being a sensible man, refused to do it, but set himself, on the contrary, to observe the phenomenon, and being perfectly satisfied of the fact, he bade them take her to a physician. Meanwhile, the intensity of the influence, whatever it was, augmented. Not only articles made of oak, but all sorts of things were acted upon by it, and reacted upon her, while persons who were near her, even without contact, frequently felt electric shocks. The effects, which were diminished when she was on a carpet or a waxed cloth, were most remarkable when she was on the bare earth. They sometimes entirely ceased for 2 or 3 days, and then recommenced. Metals were not affected. Anything touched by her apron or dress would fly off, although a person held it, and Monsieur Hebert, while seated on a heavy tub or trough, was raised up with it. In short, the only place she could repose on was a stone covered with cork. They also kept her still by isolating her. When she was fatigued, the effects diminished. A needle suspended horizontally oscillated rapidly with the motion of her arm without contact, or remained fixed while deviating from the magnetic direction. Great numbers of enlightened medical and scientific men witnessed these phenomena and investigated them with every precaution to prevent imposition. She was often hurt by the violent involuntary movements she was thrown into, and was evidently afflicted by chorea. Unfortunately, her parents, poor and ignorant, insisted, much against the advice of the doctors, on exhibiting her for money, and under these circumstances she was brought to Paris, and nothing is more probable than that after the phenomena had really ceased, the girl may have been induced to simulate what had originally been genuine. The thing avowedly ceased altogether on the 10th of April, and there has been no return of it. In 1831, a young girl, also aged 14, who lived as under nursery maid in a French family, exhibited the same phenomena, and when the case of Angelique Cotton was made public, her master published hers. He says the things of such an extraordinary nature occurred as he dare not repeat, since none but an eyewitness could believe them. The thing lasted for 3 years, and there was ample time for observation. In the year 1686, a man at Brussels, called Breekmans, was similarly affected. A commission was appointed by the magistrates to investigate his condition, and being pronounced a sorcerer, he would have been burnt, had he not luckily made his escape. Many somnambulic persons are capable of giving an electric shock, and I have met with one person, not somnambulic, who informs me that he has frequently been able to do it by an effort of the will. Dr. Ennemosher relates the case of Mademoiselle Emmerich, sister to the professor of theology at Strasbourg, who also possessed this power. This young lady, who appears to have been a person of very rare merit and endowments, was afflicted with a long and singular malady, originating in a fright, in the course of which she exhibited many very curious phenomena, having fallen into a state of natural somnambulism, accompanied by a high degree of lucidity. Her body became surcharged with electricity, that it was necessary to her relief to discharge it, and she sometimes imparted a complete battery of shocks to her brother and her physician, or whoever was near her, and that frequently when they did not touch her. Professor Emmerich mentions also that she sent him a smart shock one day when he was several rooms off. He started up and rushed into her chambers, where she was in bed, and as soon as she saw him, she said, laughing, "Ah, you felt it, did you?" Mademoiselle Emmerich's illness terminated in death. Cotugno, a surgeon, relates that, having touched with his scalpel the intercostal nerve of a mouse that had bitten his leg, he received an electric shock. And where the torpedo abounds, the fishermen, in pouring water over the fish they have caught for the purpose of washing them, know if one is among them by the shock they sustain. A very extraordinary circumstance, which we may possibly attribute to some influence as the above, occurred at Rambouillet in November, 1846. The particulars are furnished by a gentleman residing on the spot at the time, and were published by the Baron Dupotel, who, however, attempts no explanation of the mystery. One morning some traveling merchants or peddlers came to the door of a farmhouse belonging to a man named Botel, and asked for some bread, which the maidservant gave them, and they went away. Subsequently, one of the party returned to ask for more, and was refused. The man, I believed, expressed some resentment and uttered vague threats, but she would not give him anything, and he departed. That night at supper the plates began to dance and roll off the table, without any visible cause, and several other unaccountable phenomena occurred, and the girl going to the door and chancing to place herself just where the peddler had stood, she was seized with convulsions and an extraordinary rotatory motion. The carter who was standing by laughed at her, and out of bravado placed himself on the same spot, when he felt almost suffocated, and was so unable to command his movements that he was overturned into a large pool in front of the house. Upon this they rushed to the curé of the parish for assistance, but he had scarcely said a prayer or two before he was attacked in the same manner, though in his own house, and his furniture began to oscillate and crack as if it were bewitched. The poor people were frightened out of their wits. By and by the phenomena intermitted, and they hoped all was over, but presently it began again, and this occurred more than once before it subsided wholly. On the 8th December, 1836, at Stuttgart, Carl Fischer, a baker's boy, aged 17, of steady habits and good character, was fixed with a basket on his shoulders, in some unaccountable way, in front of his master's house. He foresaw the thing was to happen, when he went out with his bread very early in the morning, earnestly wished that the day was over, and told his companion that if he could only cross the threshold on his return, he should escape it. It was about 6 when he did return, and his master, hearing a fearful noise which he could not describe, as if proceeding from a multitude of beings, looked out of the window, where he saw Carl violently struggling and fighting with his apron, though his feet were immovably fixed to one spot. A hissing sound proceeded from his mouth and nose, and a voice, which was neither his nor that of any person present, was heard to cry, "Stand fast, Carl!" The master says that he could not have believed such a thing, and he was so alarmed that he did not venture into the street, where numerous persons were assembled. The boy said he must remain there till 11 o'clock, and the police kept guard over him till that time, as the physician said he must not be interfered with, and the people sought to push him from the spot. When the time had expired, he was carried to the hospital, where he seemed exceedingly exhausted, and fell into a profound sleep. I meet with extraordinary records of a preternatural ringing of all the bells in a house, sometimes occurring periodically for a considerable time, and continuing after precautions have been taken, which precluded the possibility of trick or deception, the wires being cut, and vigilant eyes watching them, and yet they rung on, by day or night, just the same. It is certainly very difficult to conceive, but at the same time it is not impossible, that such strange phenomena as that of the Stockwell ghost, and many similar ones, may be the manifestations of some extraordinary electrical influence. But there are other cases of poltergeist, which it is impossible to attribute to the same cause, since they are accompanied by evident manifestations of will and intelligence. Such was the instance related in Southey's Life of Wesley, which occurred in the year 1716, beginning with a groaning, and subsequently proceeding to all manner of noises, lifting of latches, clattering of windows, knockings of a most mysterious kind, etc. The family were not generally frightened, but the young children, when asleep, showed symptoms of great terror. This annoyance lasted, I think, 2 or 3 months, and then ceased. As in most of these cases, the dog was extremely frightened, and hid himself when the visitations commenced. In the year 1838, a circumstance of the same kind occurred in Paris, in the Rue Saint-Honoré, and not very long ago there was one in Caithness, in which most unaccountable circumstances transpired. Among the rest, stones were flung, which never hit people, but fell at their feet, in rooms perfectly closed on all sides. A gentleman who witnessed these extraordinary phenomena related the whole story to an advocate of my acquaintance, who assured me that, however impossible he found it to credit such things, he should certainly place entire reliance on that gentleman's word in any other case. Then there is the famous story of the drummer of Tedworth, and the persecution of Professor Schuppert at Gießen, in Upper Hesse, which continued, with occasional intermission, for 6 years. This affair began with a violent knocking at the door one night. Next day, stones were sent whizzing through closed rooms in all directions, so that, although no one was struck, the windows were all broken, and no sooner were new panes put in than they were broken again. He was persecuted with slaps on the face, by day and by night, so that he could get no rest, and when 2 persons were appointed by the authorities to sit by his bed to watch him, they got the slaps also. When he was reading at his desk, his lamp would suddenly rise up and remove to the other end of the room, not as if thrown, but evidently carried. His books were torn to pieces and flung at his feet, and when he was lecturing, this mischievous sprite would tear out the leaf he was reading, and it is very remarkable that the only thing that seemed available as a protection was a drawn sword brandished over his head by himself or others, which was one of the singularities attending the case of the drummer of Tedworth. Schuppert narrated all these circumstances in his public lectures, and nobody ever disputed the facts. A remarkable case of this sort occurred in the year 1670 at Keppoch, near Glasgow. There, also, stones were thrown which hit nobody, but the annoyance only continued 8 days, and there are several more to be found recorded in works of that period. The disturbance that happened in the house of Gilbert Campbell, at Glenluce, excited considerable notice. Here, as elsewhere, stones were thrown, but, as in most similar instances I meet with, no human being was damaged. The license of these spirits or goblins, or whatever they be, seeming to extend no further than worrying and tormenting their victims. In this case, however, the spirit spoke to them, though he was never seen. The annoyance commenced in November of the year 1654, I think, and continued till April, when there was some intermission till July, when it recommenced. The loss of the family from the things destroyed was ruining, for their household goods and chattels were rendered useless, their food was polluted and spoiled, and their very clothes cut to pieces while on their backs, by invisible hands, and it was in vain that all the ministers about the country assembled to exorcise this troublesome spirit, for whoever was there, the thing continued exactly the same. At length, poor Campbell applied to the Synod of Presbyters for advice, and a meeting was convened in October 1655, and a solemn day of humiliation was imposed through the whole bounds of the presbytery, for the sake of the afflicted family. Whether it was owing to this or not, there ensued an alleviation from that time till April, and from April till August they were entirely free, and hoped all was over. But then it began again, worse than ever, and they were dreadfully tormented through the autumn, after which the disturbance ceased, and although the family lived in the house many years afterward, nothing of the sort ever happened again. End of section 24. Recording by Warren Kati, Gurnee, Illinois. Section 25 of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Warren Kati, Gurnee, Illinois. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers, by Catherine Crowe. Chapter 16. The Poltergeist of the Germans, and Possession, Part 2. There was another famous case, which occurred at a place called Ringcroft, in Kirkcudbright, in the year 1695. The afflicted family bore the name of Mackey. In this instance the stones did sometimes hit them, and they were beaten as if by staves. They, as well as strangers who came to the house, were lifted off the ground by their clothes. Their bed coverings were taken off their beds. Things were visibly carried about the house by invisible hands. Several people were hurt, even to the effusion of blood, by stones and blows. There were fireballs seen about the house, which were several times ignited. People, both of the family and others, felt themselves grasped as if by a hand. Then there was groaning, crying, whistling, and a voice that frequently spoke to them. Crowds of people went to the house, but the thing continued just the same whether there were many or few, and sometimes the whole building shook as if it were coming down. A day of humiliation was appointed in this case also, but without the least effect. The disturbance commenced in February, and ended on the 1st of May. Numberless people witnessed the phenomenon, and the account of it is attested by 14 ministers and gentlemen. The same sort of thing occurred in the year 1659, in a place inhabited by an evangelical bishop, called Schlotterbeck. It began in the same manner, by throwing of stones and other things, many of which came through the roof, insomuch that they believed at first that some animal was concealed there. However, nothing could be found, and the invisible guest soon proceeded to other annoyances, similar to those above mentioned, and though they could not see him, his footsteps were forever heard about the house. At length, wearied out, the bishop applied to the government for aid, and they sent him a company of soldiers to guard the house by day and night, out of which he and his family retired. But the goblin cared no more for the soldiers than it had done for the city watch. The thing continued without intermission, whoever was there, till it ceased of its own accord. There was a house at Aix-la-Chapelle that was for several years quite uninhabitable from a similar cause. I could mention many other cases, and, as I have said before, they occur in all countries, but these will suffice as specimens of the class. It is in vain for people who were not on the spot to laugh and assert that these were the mischievous tricks of servants or others, when those who were there, and who had such a deep interest in unraveling the mystery, and such abundance of time and opportunity for doing it, could find no solution whatever. In many of the above cases, the cattle were unloosed, the horses were turned out of their stables, and uniformly all the animals in the way exhibited great terror, sweating and trembling, while the visitation continued. Since we cannot but believe that man forms but one class in an immense range of existences, do not these strange occurrences suggest the idea that, occasionally, some individual out of this gamut of beings comes into rapport with us, or crosses our path like a comet, and that, while certain conditions last, it can hover about us, and play these puckish, mischievous tricks, till the charm is broken, and then it re-enters its own sphere, and we are cognizant of it no more. But one of the most extraordinary examples of this kind of annoyance is that which occurred, in the year 1806, in the castle of Prince Hohenlohe, in Silesia. The account is given at length by Councillor Hahn of Ingelfingen, who witnessed the circumstances, and in consequence of the various remarks that have been since made on the subject in different publications, he has repeatedly reasserted the facts in letters, which have been printed and laid before the public. I cannot, therefore, see what right we have to disbelieve a man of honor and character, as he is said to be, merely because the circumstances he narrates are unaccountable, more especially as the story, strange as it is, by no means stands alone in the annals of demonology. The following details were written down at the time the events occurred, and they were communicated by Councillor Hahn to Dr. Kerner in the year 1828. After the campaign of the Prussians against the French in the year 1806, the reigning Prince of Hohenlohe gave orders to Councillor Hahn, who was in his service, to proceed to Slawensick, and there to wait his return. His Serene Highness advanced from Liegnitz toward his principality, and Hahn commenced his journey toward Upper Silesia on the 19th November. At the same period, Charles Kern of Kunzlau, who had fallen into the hands of the French, being released on parole, and arriving at Liegnitz in an infirm condition, he was allowed to spend some time with Hahn while awaiting his exchange. Hahn and Kern had been friends in their youth, and their destinies having brought them both at this time into the Prussian states, they were lodged together in the same apartment of the castle, which was one on the first floor, forming an angle at the back of the building, one side looking toward the north and the other to the east. On the right of the door of this room was a glass door, which led into a chamber divided from those which followed by a wainscot partition. The door in this wainscot, which communicated to those adjoining rooms, was entirely closed up, because in them all sorts of household utensils were kept. Neither in this chamber nor in the sitting room which preceded it was there any opening whatever which could furnish the means of communication from without, nor was there anybody in the castle besides the two friends, except the prince's two coachmen and Hahn's servant. The whole party were fearless people, and as for Hahn and Kern, they believed in nothing less than ghosts or witches, nor had any previous experience induced them to turn their thoughts in that direction. Hahn, during his collegiate life, had been much given to philosophy, had listened to Fichte, and earnestly studied the writings of Kant. The result of his reflections was a pure materialism, and he looked upon created man not as an aim, but merely as a means to a yet undeveloped end. These opinions he has since changed, like many others who think very differently in their 40th year to what they did in their 20th. The particulars here given are necessary in order to obtain credence for the following extraordinary narrative, and to establish the fact that the phenomena were not merely accepted by ignorant superstition, but coolly and courageously investigated by enlightened minds. During the first days of their residence in the castle, the two friends, living together in solitude, amused their long evenings with the works of Schiller, of whom they were both great admirers, and Hahn usually read aloud. 3 days had thus passed quietly away when, as they were sitting at the table, which stood in the middle of the room, about 9 o'clock in the evening, their reading was interrupted by a small shower of lime, which fell around them. They looked at the ceiling, concluding it must have come thence, but could perceive no abraded parts. And while they were yet seeking to ascertain whence the lime had proceeded, there suddenly fell several larger pieces, which were quite cold, and appeared as if they had belonged to the external wall. At length, concluding the lime must have fallen from some part of the wall, giving up further inquiry, they went to bed, and slept quietly till morning, when, on awakening, they were somewhat surprised at the quantity which strewed the floor, more especially as they could still discover no part of the walls or ceiling from which it could have fallen. But they thought no more of the matter till evening, when, instead of the lime falling as before, it was thrown, and several pieces struck Hahn. At the same time they heard heavy blows, sometimes below and sometimes over their heads, like the sound of distant guns. Still, attributing these sounds to natural causes, they went to bed as usual, but the uproar prevented their sleeping, and each accused the other of occasioning it by kicking with his feet against the footboard of his bed, till, finding that the noise continued when they both got out and stood together in the middle of the room, they were satisfied that this was not the case. On the following evening a third noise was added, which resembled the faint and distant beating of a drum. Upon this they requested the governess of the castle to send them the key of the apartments above and below, which was brought to them by her son, and while he and Kern went to make their investigations, Hahn remained in their own room. Above, they found an empty room. Below, a kitchen. They knocked, but the noise they made was very different to that which Hahn continued all the while to hear around him. When they returned, Hahn said jestingly, "The place is haunted." On this night, when they went to bed, with a light burning, they heard what seemed like a person walking about the room, with slippers on, and a stick with which he struck the floor as he moved step by step. Hahn continued to jest, and Kern to laugh, at the oddness of these circumstances, for some time, when they both, as usual, fell asleep, neither in the slightest degree disturbed by these events, nor inclined to attribute them to any supernatural cause. But on the following evening the affair became more inexplicable. Various articles in the room were thrown about: knives, forks, brushes, caps, slippers, padlocks, funnels, snuffers, soap, everything, in short, that was movable. While lights darted from the corners, and everything was in confusion, at the same time the lime fell and the blows continued. Upon this, the two friends called up the servants, Knittel, the castle watch, and whoever else was at hand, to be witnesses of these mysterious operations. In the morning all was quiet, and generally continued so till after midnight. One evening, Kern going into the chamber to fetch something, and hearing an uproar that almost drove him backward to the door, Hahn caught up the light, and both rushed into the room, where they found a large piece of wood lying close to the wainscot. But supposing this to be the cause of the noise, who had set it in motion? For Kern was sure the door was shut, even while the noise was making, neither had there been any wood in the room. Frequently, before their eyes, the knives and snuffers rose from the table, and fell, after some minutes, to the ground, and Hahn's large shears were once lifted in this manner between him and one of the prince's cooks, and falling to the ground, stuck into the floor. As some nights, however, passed quite quietly, Hahn was determined not to leave the rooms, but when, for 3 weeks, the disturbance was so constant that they could get no rest, they resolved on removing their beds into the large room above, in hopes of once more enjoying a little quiet sleep. Their hopes were in vain. The thumping continued as before, and not only so, but articles flew about the room, which they were quite sure they had left below. "They may fling as they will," cried Hahn, "sleep I must." Well, Kern began to undress, pondering on these matters as he walked up and down the room. Suddenly Hahn saw him stand, as if transfixed, before the looking-glass on which he had accidentally cast his eyes. He had so stood for some time, when he was seized with a violent trembling, and turned from the mirror with his face as white as death. Hahn, fancying the cold of an uninhabited room had seized him, hastened to throw a cloak over him, when Kern, who was naturally very courageous, recovered himself, and related, though with trembling lips, that as he had accidentally looked in the glass, he had seen a white female figure looking out of it. She was in front of his own image, which he distinctly saw behind her. At first he could not believe his eyes. He thought it must be fancy, and for that reason he had stood so long. But when he saw that the eyes of the figure moved, and looked into his, a shudder had seized him, and he had turned away. Hahn, upon this, advanced with firm steps to the front of the mirror, and called upon the apparition to show itself to him, but he saw nothing, although he remained a quarter of an hour before the glass, and frequently repeated his exhortation. Kern then related that the features of the apparition were very old, but not gloomy or morose. The expression was that of indifference, but the face was very pale, and the head was wrapped in a cloth, which left only the features visible. By this time it was 4 o'clock in the morning. Sleep was banished from their eyes, and they resolved to return to the lower room and have their beds brought back again. But the people who were sent to fetch them returned, declaring they could not open the door, although it did not appear to be fastened. They were sent back again, but a second and a third time they returned with the same answer. Then Hahn went himself, and opened it with the greatest ease. The 4 servants, however, solemnly declared that all their united strength could make no impression on it. In this way a month had elapsed. The strange events of the castle had got spread abroad, and among others who desired to convince themselves of the facts were 2 Bavarian officers of dragoons, namely Captain Cornet and Lieutenant Magerl, of the regiment of Minucci. Magerl offering to remain in the room alone, the others left him, but scarcely had they passed into the next apartment when they heard Magerl storming like a man in a passion, and cutting away at the tables and chairs with his saber, whereupon the captain thought it advisable to return in order to rescue the furniture from his rage. They found the door shut, but he opened it on their summons, and related, in great excitement, that as soon as they had quitted the room, some cursed thing had begun to fling lime and other matters at him, and having examined every part of the room without being able to discover the agent of the mischief, he had fallen into a rage and cut madly about him. The party now passed the rest of the evening together in the room, and the 2 Bavarians closely watched Hahn and Kern in order to satisfy themselves that the mystery was no trick of theirs. All at once, as they were quietly sitting at the table, the snuffers rose into the air and fell again to the ground behind Magerl, and a leaden ball flew at Hahn and hit him upon the breast, and presently afterward they heard a noise at the glass door, as if somebody had struck his fist through it, together with a sound of falling glass. On investigation they found the door entire, but a broken drinking glass on the floor. By this time the Bavarians were convinced, and they retired from the room to seek repose in one more peaceful. Among other things, the following, which occurred to Hahn, is remarkable. One evening, about 8 o'clock, being about to shave himself, the implements for the purpose, which were lying on a pyramidal stand in a corner of the room, flew at him, one after the other, the soap-box, the razor, the brush, and the soap, and fell at his feet, although he was standing several paces from the pyramid. He and Kern, who was sitting at the table, laughed, for they were now so accustomed to these events that they only made them subjects of diversion. In the meantime Hahn poured some water, which had been standing on the stove, in a basin, observing, as he dipped his finger into it, that it was of a nice heat for shaving. He seated himself before the table and strapped his razor, but when he attempted to prepare the lather, the water was clean vanished out of the basin. Another time Hahn was awakened by goblins throwing at him a squeezed-up piece of sheet-lead in which tobacco had been wrapped, and when he stooped to pick it up, the self-same piece was flung at him again. When this was repeated a third time, Hahn flung a heavy stick at his invisible assailant. Dorfel, the bookkeeper, was frequently a witness to these strange events. He once laid his cap on the table by the stove, when, being about to depart, he sought for it. It had vanished. 4 or 5 times he examined the table in vain. Presently afterward he saw it lying exactly where he had placed it when he came in. On the same table, Knittel, having once placed his cap and drawn himself a seat, suddenly, although there was nobody near the table, he saw the cap flying through the room to his feet, where it fell. Hahn now determined to find out the secret himself, and for this purpose seated himself, with 2 lights before him, in a position where he could see the whole of the room and all the doors and windows it contained. But the same things occurred, even when Kern was out, the servants in the stable, and nobody in the room but himself, and the snuffers were, as usual, flung about, although the closest observation could not detect by whom. The forest-master, Radzensky, spent the night in the room, but, although the 2 friends slept, he could get no rest. He was bombarded without intermission, and in the morning his bed was found full of all manner of household articles. One morning, in spite of all the drumming and flinging, Hahn was determined to sleep, but a heavy blow on the wall close to his bed soon awoke him from his slumbers. A second time he went to sleep, and was wakened by a sensation as if some person had dipped his finger in water and was sprinkling his face with it. He pretended to sleep again, while he watched Kern and Niddle, who were sitting at the table. The sensation of sprinkling returned, but he could find no water on his face. About this time Hahn had occasion to make a journey as far as Breslau, and when he returned he heard the strangest story of all. In order not to be alone in this mysterious chamber, Kern had engaged Hahn's servant, a man of about 40 years of age, and of entire singleness of character, to stay with him. One night, as Kern lay in his bed, and this man was standing near the glass door in conversation with him, to his utter amazement he beheld a jug of beer, which stood on a table in the room at some distance from him, slowly lifted to a height of about 3 feet, and the contents poured into a glass that was standing there also, until the latter was half full. The jug was then gently replaced, and the glass lifted and emptied as by some one drinking, while John, the servant, exclaimed in terrified surprise, "Lord Jesus, it swallows!" The glass was quietly replaced, and not a drop of beer was to be found on the floor. Hahn was about to require an oath of John in confirmation of this fact, but forbore, seeing how ready the man was to take one, and satisfied of the truth of the relation. One night Netsch, an inspector of the works, passed the night with his 2 friends, and in spite of the unintermitting flinging, they all 3 went to bed. There were lights in the room, and presently all 3 saw 2 napkins, in the middle of the room, rise slowly up to the ceiling, and, having there spread themselves out, flutter down again. The china bowl of a pipe belonging to Kern flew about and was broken. Knives and forks were flung, and at last one of the latter fell on Hahn's head, though fortunately with the handle downward, and having now endured this annoyance for 2 months, it was unanimously resolved to abandon this mysterious chamber, for this night at all events. John and Kern took up one of the beds and carried it into the opposite room, where they were no sooner gone than a pitcher for holding chalybeate water flew to the feet of the 2 who remained behind, although no door was open, and a brass candlestick was flung to the ground. In the opposite room the night passed quietly, although some sound still issued from the forsaken chamber. After this there was a cessation to these strange proceedings, and nothing more remarkable occurred, with the exception of the following circumstance. Some weeks after the above-mentioned removal, as Hahn was returning home and crossing the bridge that leads to the castle gate, he heard the foot of a dog behind him. He looked round, and called repeatedly on the name of a greyhound that was much attached to him, thinking it might be her. But although he still heard the foot, even when he ascended the stairs, he could see nothing. He concluded it was an illusion. Scarcely, however, had he set foot within the room, than Kern advanced and took the door out of his hand, at the same time calling the dog by name, immediately adding, however, that he thought he had seen the dog, but that he had no sooner called her than she disappeared. Hahn then inquired if he had really seen the dog. "Certainly I did," replied Kern. "She was close behind you, half within the door, and that was the reason I took it out of your hand, lest, not observing her, you should have shut it suddenly and crushed her. It was a white dog, and I took it for Flora. Search was immediately made for the dog, but she was found locked up in the stable, and had not been out of it the whole day. It is certainly remarkable, even supposing Hahn to have been deceived with respect to the footsteps, that Kern should have seen a white dog behind him before he had heard a word on the subject from his friend, especially as there was no such animal in the neighborhood. Besides, it was not yet dark, and Kern was very sharp-sighted. Hahn remained in the castle for half a year after this, without experiencing anything extraordinary, and even persons who had possession of the mysterious chambers were not subjected to any annoyance. The riddle, however, in spite of all the perquisitions and investigations that were set on foot, remained unsolved. No explanation of these strange events could be found, and even supposing any motive could exist, there was nobody in the neighborhood clever enough to have carried on such a system of persecution, which lasted so long that the inhabitants of the chamber became almost indifferent to it. In conclusion, it is only necessary to add that Councillor Hahn wrote down this account for his own satisfaction, with the strictest regard to the truth. His words are, quote, "I have described these events exactly as I heard and saw them. From beginning to end I observed them with the most entire self-possession. I had no fear, nor the slightest tendency to it. Yet the whole thing remains to me perfectly inexplicable. Written the 19th of November, 1808, Augustus Hahn, Councillor." Unquote. Doubtless many natural explanations of these phenomena will be suggested by those who consider themselves above the weakness of crediting stories of this description. Some will say that Kern was a dexterous juggler, who contrived to throw dust in the eyes of his friend Hahn, while others affirm that both Hahn and Kern were intoxicated every evening. I did not fail to communicate these objections to Hahn, and here insert his answer. After the events alluded to, I resided with Kern for a quarter of a year in another part of the castle of Slawensick, which has since been struck by lightning and burnt, without finding a solution of the mystery, or experiencing a repetition of the annoyance, which discontinued from the moment we quitted those particular apartments. Those persons must suppose me very weak, who can imagine it possible that, with only one companion, I could have been the subject of his sport for 2 months, without detecting him. As for Kern himself, he was, from the first, very anxious to leave the rooms, but as I was unwilling to resign the hope of discovering some natural cause for these phenomena, I persisted in remaining, and the thing that at last induced me to yield to his wishes was the vexation at the loss of his china pipe, which had been flung against the wall and broken. Besides, jugglery requires a juggler, and I was frequently quite alone when these events occurred. It is equally absurd to accuse us of intoxication. The wine there was too dear for us to drink at all, and we confined ourselves wholly to weak beer. All the circumstances that happened are not set down in the narration, but my recollection of the whole is as vivid as if it had occurred yesterday. We had also many witnesses, some of whom have been mentioned. Councillor Klenk also visited me at a later period, with every desire to investigate the mystery, and when, one morning, he had mounted on a table, for the purpose of doing so, and was knocking at the ceiling with a stick, a powder-horn fell upon him, which he had just before left on the table in another room. At that time Kern had been for some time absent. I neglected no possible means that could have led to a discovery of the secret, and at least as many people have blamed me for my unwillingness to believe in a supernatural cause, as the reverse. Fear is not my failing, as all who are acquainted with me know, and, to avoid the possibility of error, I frequently asked others what they saw when I was myself present, and their answers always coincided with what I saw myself. From 1809 to 1811 I lived in Jacobswald, very near the castle where the prince himself was residing. I am aware that some singular circumstances occurred while he was there, but as I did not witness them myself, I cannot speak of them more particularly. I am still as unable as ever to account for these events, and I am content to submit to the hasty remarks of the world, knowing that I have only related the truth, and what many persons now alive witnessed, as well as myself. Councillor Hahn, Ingelfinger, August 24, 1828. The only key to this mystery ever discovered was, that after the destruction of the castle by lightning, when the ruins were removed, there was found the skeleton of a man without a coffin. His skull had been split, and a sword lay by his side. Now I am very well aware how absurd and impossible these events will appear to many people, and that they will have recourse to any explanation rather than admit them for facts. Yet, so late as the year 1835, a suit was brought before the sheriff of Edinburgh, in which Captain Molesworth was defendant, and the landlord of the house he inhabited, which was at Trinity about a couple of miles from Edinburgh, was plaintiff, founded upon circumstances not so varied, certainly, but quite as inexplicable. The suit lasted 2 years, and I have been favored with the particulars of the case by Mr. M.L., the advocate employed by the plaintiff, who spent many hours in examining the numerous witnesses, several of whom were officers of the army and gentlemen of undoubted honor and capacity for observation. Captain Molesworth took the house of a Mr. Webster, who resided in the adjoining one, in May or June 1835, and when he had been in it about 2 months, he began to complain of sundry extraordinary noises, which, finding it impossible to account for, he took it into his head, strangely enough, were made by Mr. Webster. The latter naturally represented that it was not probable he should desire to damage the reputation of his own house and drive his tenant out of it, and retorted the accusation. Still, as these noises and knockings continued, Captain Molesworth not only lifted the boards in the room most infected, but actually made holes in the wall, which divided his residence from Mr. Webster's, for the purpose of detecting the delinquent, of course without success. Do what they would, the thing went on just the same. Footsteps of invisible feet, knockings and scratchings and rustlings, first on one side and then on the other, were heard daily and nightly. Sometimes this unseen agent seemed to be knocking to a certain tune, and if a question were addressed to it, which could be answered numerically as, "How many people are there in this room?" for example, it would answer by so many knocks. The beds, too, were occasionally heaved up, as if somebody were underneath, and where the knockings were, the wall trembled visibly, but, search as they would, no one could be found. Captain Molesworth had had 2 daughters, one of whom, named Matilda, had lately died. The other, a girl between 12 and 13, called Jane, was sickly, and generally kept her bed. And as it was observed that, wherever she was, these noises most frequently prevailed, Mr. Webster, who did not like the mala fama that was attaching itself to his house, declared that she made them, while the people in the neighborhood believed that it was the ghost of Matilda, warning her sister that she was soon to follow. Sheriff's officers, masons, justices of peace, and the officers of the regiment quartered at Leite, who were friends of Captain Molesworth, all came to his aid, in hopes of detecting or frightening away his tormentor, but in vain. Sometimes it was said to be a trick of somebody outside the house, and then they formed a cordon round it, and next, as the poor sick girl was suspected, they tied her up in a bag, but it was all to no purpose. At length, ill and wearied out by the annoyances and the anxieties attending the affair, Captain Molesworth quitted the house, and Mr. Webster brought an action against him for the damages committed by lifting the boards, breaking the walls, and firing at the wainscot, as well as for the injury done to his house by saying it was haunted, which prevented other tenants taking it. The poor young lady died, hastened out of the world, it is said, by the severe measures used while she was under suspicion, and the persons that have since inhabited the house have experienced no repetition of the annoyance. The manner in which these strange persecutions attach themselves to certain persons and places seems somewhat analogous to another class of cases, which bear a great similarity to what was formerly called possession, and I must here observe that many German physicians maintain that, to this day, instances of genuine possession occur, and there are several works published in their language on the subject, and for this malady they consider magnetism the only remedy, all others being worse than useless. Indeed, they look upon possession itself as a demono-magnetic state, in which the patient is in rapport with mischievous or evil spirits, as in the agatho or good magnetic state, which is the opposite pole, he is in rapport with good ones, and they particularly warn their readers against confounding this infliction with cases of epilepsy or mania. They assert that, although instances are comparatively rare, both sexes and all ages are equally subject to this misfortune, and that it is quite an error to suppose either that it has ceased since the resurrection of Christ, or that the expression used in the Scriptures, quote, "possessed by a devil," unquote, meant merely insanity or convulsions. This disease, which is not contagious, was well known to the Greeks, and in later times Hoffman has recorded several well-established instances. Among the distinguishing symptoms, they reckon the patient speaking in a voice that is not his own, frightful convulsions and motions of the body, which arise suddenly, without any previous indisposition, blasphemous and obscene talk, a knowledge of what is secret, and of the future, a vomiting of extraordinary things, such as hair, stones, pins, needles, etc. I need scarcely observe that this opinion is not universal in Germany; still, it obtains among many who have had considerable opportunities for observation. Dr. Bardilli had a case in the year 1830, which he considered decidedly to be one of possession. The patient was a peasant woman, aged 34, who never had any sickness whatever, and the whole of whose bodily functions continued perfectly regular, while she exhibited the following strange phenomena. I must observe that she was happily married, and had 3 children, was not a fanatic, and bore an excellent character for regularity and industry, when, without any warning or perceptible cause, she was seized with the most extraordinary convulsions, while a strange voice proceeded from her, which assumed to be that of an unblessed spirit, who had formerly inhabited a human form. While these fits were on her, she entirely lost her own individuality, and became this person. On returning to herself, her understanding and character were as entire as before. The blasphemy and cursing, and barking and screeching, were dreadful. She was wounded and injured severely by the violent falls and blows she gave herself, and when she had an intermission, she could do nothing but weep over what they told her had passed, and the state in which she saw herself. She was, moreover, reduced to a skeleton, for when she wanted to eat, the spoon was turned round in her hand, and she often fasted for days together. This affliction lasted for 3 years. All remedies failed, and the only alleviation she obtained was by the continued and earnest prayers of those about her, and her own, for although this demon did not like prayers, and violently opposed her kneeling down, even forcing her to outrageous fits of laughter, still they had a power over him. It is remarkable that pregnancy, confinement, and the nursing her child made not the least difference in this woman's condition. All went on regularly, but the demon kept his post. At length, being magnetized, the patient fell into a partially somnambulic state, in which another voice was heard to proceed from her, being that of her protecting spirit, which encouraged her to patience and hope, and promised that the evil guest would be obliged to vacate his quarters. She often now fell into a magnetic state without the aid of a magnetizer. At the end of 3 years she was entirely relieved, and as well as ever. In the case of Rosina Wilden, aged 10 years, which occurred at Pleidelsheim in 1834, the demon used to announce himself by crying out, "Here I am again," whereupon the weak, exhausted child, who had been lying like one dead, would rage and storm in a voice like a man's, perform the most extraordinary movements and feats of violence and strength, till he would cry out, "Now I must be off again." This spirit spoke generally in the plural number, for he said she had another besides himself, a dumb devil, who plagued her most. He it is that twirls her round and round, distorts her features, turns her eyes, locks her teeth, etc. What he bids me, I must do. This child was at length cured by magnetism. Barbara Rieger of Steenbach, aged 10, in 1834, was possessed by 2 spirits, who spoke in 2 distinctly different male voices and dialects. One said he had formerly been a mason, the other gave himself out for a deceased provisor, the latter of whom was much the worst of the 2. When they spoke, the child closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, she knew nothing of what they had said. The mason confessed to have been a great sinner, but the provisor was proud and hardened, and would confess nothing. They often commanded food, and made her eat it, which, when she recovered her individuality, she felt nothing of, but was very hungry. The mason was very fond of brandy and drank a great deal, and if not brought when he ordered it, his raging and storming was dreadful. In her own individuality, the child had the greatest aversion to this liquor. They treated her for worms and other disorders without the least effect, till at length, by magnetism, the mason was cast out. The provisor was more tenacious, but finally they got rid of him too, and the girl remained quite well. In 1835, a respectable citizen, whose full name is not given, was brought to Dr. Kerner. He was aged 37, and till the last 7 years had been unexceptionable in conduct and character. An unaccountable change had, however, come over him in his 30th year, which made his family very unhappy, and at length, one day, a strange voice suddenly spoke out of him, saying that he was the late magistrate S., and that he had been in him 6 years. When the spirit was driven out, by magnetism, the man fell to the earth, and was almost torn to pieces by the violence of the struggle. He then lay for a space as if dead, and arose quite well and free. In another case, a young woman at Gruppenbach was quite in her senses, and heard the voice of her demon, who was also a deceased person, speak out of her, without having any power to suppress it. In short, instances of this description seem by no means rare, and if such a phenomenon as possession ever did exist, I do not see what right we have to assert that it exists no longer, since, in fact, we know nothing about it, only that being determined to admit nothing so contrary to the ideas of the present day, we set out by deciding that the thing is impossible. Since these cases occur in other countries, no doubt they must do so in this, and indeed I have met with one instance much more remarkable in its details than any of those above mentioned, which occurred at Bishop's Wearmouth, near Sunderland, in the year 1840, and as the particulars of this case have been published and attested by 2 physicians and 2 surgeons, not to mention the evidence of numerous other persons, I think we are bound to accept the facts, whatever interpretation we may choose to put upon them. The patient, named Mary Jobson, was between 12 and 13 years of age. Her parents, respectable people in humble life, and herself an attendant on a Sunday school. She became ill in November 1839, and was soon afterwards seized with terrific fits, which continued at intervals for 11 weeks. It was during this period that the family first observed a strange knocking, which they could not account for. It was sometimes in one place, and sometimes in another, and even about the bed, when the girl lay in a quiet sleep, with her hands folded outside the clothes. They next heard a strange voice, which told them circumstances they did not know, but which they afterward found to be correct. Then there was a noise like the clashing of arms, and such a rumbling that the tenant below thought the house was coming down. Footsteps where nobody was to be seen, water falling on the floor, no one knew whence, locked doors opened, and above all, sounds of ineffably sweet music. The doctors and the father were suspicious, and every precaution was taken, but no solution of the mystery could be found. This spirit, however, was a good one, and it preached to them, and gave them a great deal of good advice. Many persons went to witness this strange phenomenon, and some were desired to go by the voice, when in their own homes. Thus, Elizabeth Gauntlet, while attending to some domestic affairs at home, was startled by hearing a voice say, "Be thou faithful, and thou shalt see the works of thy God, and shalt hear with thine ears." She cried out, "My God, what can this be?" and presently she saw a large white cloud near her. On the same evening, the voice said to her, "Mary Jobson, one of your scholars, is sick. Go and see her, and it will be good for you." This person did not know where the child lived, but having inquired the address, she went, and at the door she heard the same voice bid her go up. On entering the room she heard another voice, soft and beautiful, which bade her to be faithful, and said, "I am the Virgin Mary." This voice promised her a sign at home, and accordingly, that night, while reading the Bible, she heard it say, "Jemima, be not afraid, it is I. If you keep my commandments, it shall be well with you." When she repeated her visit, the same things occurred, and she heard the most exquisite music. The same sort of phenomena were witnessed by everybody who went. The immoral were rebuked, the good encouraged. Some were bidden instantly to depart, and were forced to go. The voices of several deceased persons of the family were also heard, and made revelations. Once the voice said, "Look up, and you shall see the sun and moon on the ceiling," and immediately there appeared a beautiful representation of these planets in lively colors, green, yellow, and orange. Moreover, these figures were permanent. But the father, who was a long time skeptical, insisted on whitewashing them over. However, they still remained visible. Among other things, the voice said that though the child appeared to suffer, she did not; that she did not know where her body was, and that her own spirit had left it, and another had entered, and that her body was made a speaking trumpet. The voice told the family and visitors many things of their distant friends, which proved true. The girl twice saw a divine form standing by her bedside who spoke to her, and Joseph Ragg, one of the persons who had been invited by the voice to go, saw a beautiful and heavenly figure come to his bedside about 11 o'clock at night, on the 17th of January. It was in male attire, surrounded by a radiance. It came a second time on the same night. On each occasion it opened its curtains and looked at him benignantly, remaining about a quarter of an hour. When it went away, the curtains fell back into their former position. One day, while in the sick child's room, Margaret Watson saw a lamb, which passed through the door and entered a place where the father, John Jobson, was, but he did not see it. One of the most remarkable features in this case is the beautiful music which was heard by all parties, as well as the family, including the unbelieving father, and indeed it seems to have been in a great degree that this converted him at last. The music was heard repeatedly during a space of 16 weeks. Sometimes it was like an organ, but more beautiful. At others there was a singing of holy songs, in parts, and the words distinctly heard. The sudden appearance of water in the room, too, was most unaccountable, for they felt it, and it was really water. When the voice desired that water should be sprinkled, it immediately appeared as if sprinkled. At another time, a sign being promised to the skeptical father, water would appear on the floor. This happened not once, but 20 times. During the whole course of this affair, the voices told them that there was a miracle to be wrought on this child, and accordingly, on the 22nd of June, when she was as ill as ever, and they were only praying for her death, at 5 o'clock the voice ordered that her clothes should be laid out, and that everybody should leave the room except the infant, which was 2 years and a half old. They obeyed, and having been outside the door a quarter of an hour, the voice cried, "Come in!" And when they entered, they saw the girl completely dressed and quite well, sitting in a chair with the infant on her knee, and she had not had an hour's illness from that time till the report was published, which was on the 30th of January, 1841. Now, it is very easy to laugh at all this, and assert that these things never happened, because they are absurd and impossible. But while honest, well-meaning, and intelligent people, who were on the spot, assert that they did, I confess I find myself constrained to believe them, however much I find in the case which is discrepant from my notions. It was not an affair of a day or an hour. There was ample time for observation, for the phenomena continued from the 9th of February to the 22nd of June, and the determined unbelief of the father regarding the possibility of spiritual appearances, insomuch that he ultimately expressed great regret for the harshness he had used, is a tolerable security against imposition. Moreover, they pertinaciously refused to receive any money or assistance whatever, and were more likely to suffer in public opinion than otherwise by the avowal of these circumstances. Dr. Clanny, who publishes the report with the attestations of the witnesses, is a physician of many years' experience, and is also, I believe, the inventor of the improved Davy lamp, and he declares his entire conviction of the facts, assuring his readers that many persons holding high rank in the established church, ministers of other denominations, as well as many lay members of society, highly respected for learning and piety, are equally satisfied. When he first saw the child lying on her back, apparently insensible, her eyes suffused with florid blood, he felt assured that she had a disease of the brain, and he was not in the least disposed to believe in the mysterious part of the affair, till subsequent investigation compelled him to do so, and that his belief is of a very decided character we may feel assured, when he is content to submit to all the obloquy he must incur by avowing it. He adds that, since the girl has been quite well, both her family and that of Joseph Ragg have frequently heard the same heavenly music as they did during her illness, and Mr. Torbach, a surgeon, who expresses himself satisfied of the truth of the above particulars, also mentions another case, in which he, as well as a dying person he was attending, heard divine music just before the dissolution. Of this last phenomenon, namely, sounds as of heavenly music being heard when a death was occurring, I have met with numerous instances. From the investigation of the above case, Dr. Clanny has arrived at the conviction that the spiritual world do occasionally identify themselves with our affairs, and Dr. Drury asserts that, besides this instance, he has met with another circumstance which has left him firmly convinced that we live in a world of spirits, and that he has been in the presence of an unearthly being who had passed that bourne from which, it is said, no traveler returns. But the most extraordinary case I have yet met with is the following, because it is one which cannot, by any possibility, be attributed to disease or illusion. It is furnished to me from the most undoubted authority, and I give it as I received it, with the omission of the names. I have indeed, in this instance, thought it right to change the initial and substitute G for the right one, the particulars being of a nature which demand the greatest delicacy as regards the parties concerned. Mrs. S.C. Hall, in early life, was intimately acquainted with the family, one of whom, Richard G., a young officer in the army, was subject to a harassing visitation of a kind that is usually regarded as supernatural. Mrs. H. once proposed to pay a visit to her particular friend, Catherine G., but was told that it would not be convenient exactly at that time, as Richard was on the point of coming home. She thought the inconvenience consistent in the want of a bedroom, and spoke of sleeping with Miss G., but found that the objection really lay in the fact of Richard being haunted, which rendered it impossible for anybody else to be comfortable in the same house with him. A few weeks after Richard's return, Mrs. Hall heard of Mrs. G.'s being extremely ill, and found, on going to call, that it was owing to nothing but the distress the old lady suffered in consequence of the strange circumstance connected with her son. It appeared that Richard, wherever he was, at home, in camp, in lodgings, abroad, or in his own country, was liable to be visited in his bedroom at night by certain extraordinary noises. Any light he kept in the room was sure to be put out. Something went beating about the walls and his bed, making a great noise, and often shifting close to his face, but never becoming visible. If a cage bird was in the room, it was certain to be found dead in the morning. If he kept a dog in the apartment, it would make away from him as soon as released, and never come near him again. His brother, even his mother, had slept in the room, but the visitation took place as usual. According to Miss G's report, she and other members of the family would listen at the bedroom door, after Richard had gone to sleep, and would hear the noises commence, and they would hear him sit up and express his vexation by a few military execrations. The young man, at length, was obliged by this pest to quit the army and go upon half pay. Under its influence he became a sort of Cain, for wherever he lived, the annoyance was so great that he was quickly obliged to remove. Mrs. Hall heard of his having ultimately gone to settle in Ireland, where, however, according to a brother whom she met about 4 years ago, the visitation which afflicted him in his early years was in no degree abated. This cannot be called a case of possession, but seems to be one of a rapport, which attaches this invisible tormentor to his victim. End of section 25. Recording by Warren Kati, Gurnee, Illinois.
Chapter 17 of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers, by Crowe. Chapter 17. Miscellaneous Phenomena. In a former chapter, I alluded to the form seen floating over graves by Billing, Phaethos amanuensis. By some persons, this luminous form is seen only as a light, just as occurs in many of the apparition cases I have related. How far Baron Reichenbach is correct in his conclusion that these figures are merely the result of the chemical process going on below, it's impossible for anyone at present to say. The fact that these lights do not always hover over the graves, but sometimes move from them, militates against this opinion, as I have before observed, and the insubstantial nature of the form which reconstructed itself after Pfeffel had passed his stick through it proves nothing, since the same thing is asserted of all apparitions I meet with, let them be seen where they may, except in such very extraordinary cases as that of the Bride of Corinth, supposing that story to be true. At the same time, although these cases are not made out to be chemical phenomena, neither are we entitled to class them under the head of what is commonly understood by the word ghost, whereby we comprehend a shadowy shape informed by an intelligent spirit. But there are some cases, a few of which I'll mention, that it seems extremely difficult to include under one category or the other. The late Lieutenant General Robertson of Lowers, who served during the whole of the American War, brought home with him at its termination a Negro, who went by the name of Black Tom, and who continued in his service. The room appropriated to the use of this man, in the General's town residence, I speak of Edinburgh, was on the ground floor, and he was heard frequently to complain that he could not rest in it, for that every night the figure of a headless lady, with a child in her arms, rose out of the hearth and frightened him dreadfully. Of course nobody believed this story, and it was supposed to be the dream of intoxication, as Tom was not remarkable for sobriety. But, strange to say, when the old mansion was pulled down to build Gillespie Hospital, which stands on its site, there was found, under the hearthstone in that apartment, a box containing the body of a female from which the head had been severed, and beside her lay the remains of an infant wrapped in a pillowcase trimmed with lace. She appeared, poor lady, to have been cut off in the blossom of her sins, for she was dressed, and her scissors were yet hanging by a ribbon to her side, and her thimble was also in the box, having apparently fallen from the shriveled finger. Now, whether we are to consider this a ghost, or a phenomenon of the same nature as that seen by Billing, it is difficult to decide. Somewhat similar is the following case, which I have borrowed from a little work entitled Supernaturalism in New England. Not only does this little extract prove that the same phenomena, be they interpreted as they may, exist in all parts of the world, but I think it will be granted me that, although we have not here the confirmation that time furnished in the former instance, Yet it is difficult to suppose that this unexcitable person should have been the subject of so extraordinary a spectral illusion. Whoever has seen Great Pond in the east parish of Haverhill has seen one of the very loveliest of the 1,000 little lakes or ponds of New England. With its soft slopes of greenest verdure, its white and sparkly sand rim, its southern hem of pine and maple mirrored with spray and leaf in the glassy water, its graceful hill sentinels round about, white with the orchard bloom of spring or tasseled with the corn of autumn, its long sweep of blue waters broken here and there by picturesque headlands, it would seem a spot of all others where spirits of evil must shrink, rebuked and abashed, from the presence of the beautiful. Yet here too has the shadow of the supernatural fallen. A lady of my acquaintance, a staid and imaginative church member, states that a few years ago she was standing in the angle formed by two roads, one of which traverses the pond shore, the other leading over the hill which rises abruptly from the water. It was a warm summer evening, just at sunset. She was startled by the appearance of a horse and cart, of the kind used a century ago in New England, driving rapidly down the steep hillside and crossing the wall a few yards before her, without noise or displacing of a stone. The driver sat sternly erect, with a fierce countenance, grasping the reins tightly, and looking neither to the right nor to the left. Behind the cart, and apparently lashed to it, was a woman of gigantic size, her countenance convulsed with a blended expression of rage and agony, writhing and struggling like Laocoon in the folds of the serpent. Her head, neck, feet and arms were naked. Wild locks of grey hair streamed back from the temples corrugated and darkened. The horrible cavalcade swept by across the street and disappeared at the margin of the pond. Many persons will have heard of the wild troop of Rodenstein, but few are aware of the curious amount of evidence there is in favor of the strange belief which prevails among the inhabitants of that region. The story goes that the former possessors of the castles of Rodenstein and Schnellert were robbers and pirates, who committed in conjunction all manner of enormities, and that to this day the troop, with their horses and carriages and dogs, are heard every now and then wildly rushing along the road between the two castles. It sounds like a fairy tale, yet so much was it believed that up to the middle of the last century regular reports were made to the authorities in the neighborhood of the periods when the troop had passed. Since that, the Langerich, or court lead, has been removed to Firth, and they trouble themselves no longer about the Rodenstein troop. But a traveller named Ruiz, who a few years ago undertook to examine into the affair, declares that the people assert that the passage of the visionary cavalcade still continues, and they assured him that certain houses that he saw lying in ruins were in that state because, as they lay directly in the way of the troop, they were uninhabitable. There is seldom anything seen, but the noise of carriage wheels, horses' feet, smacking of whips, blowing of horns, and the voice of these fierce hunters of men urging them on, are the sounds by which they recognize that the troop is passing from one castle to the other. And at a spot which was formerly a blacksmith, but now is a carpenter's, the invisible lord of Rodenstein still stops to have his horse shod. Mr. With copied several of the depositions out of the court records, and they are brought down to June 1764. This is certainly a strange story, but it is not much more so than that of the black man, which I know to be true. During the 7 Years' War in Germany, a drover lost his life in a drunken squabble on the high road. For some time there was a sort of rude tombstone with a cross on it to mark the spot where his body was interred, but this has long fallen, and a milestone now fills its place. Nevertheless, it continues commonly asserted by the country people, and also by various travellers, that they have been deluded in that spot by seeing, as they imagine, herds of beasts, which on investigation prove to be merely visionary. Of course, many people look upon this as superstition, but a very singular confirmation of the story occurred in the year 1826, when 2 gentlemen and 2 ladies were passing the spot in a post-carriage. One of these was a clergyman, and none of them have ever heard of the phenomenon said to be attached to the place. They had been discussing the prospects of the minister, who was on his way to a vicarage, to which he had just been appointed, when they saw a large flock of sheep, which stretched quite across the road, and was accompanied by a shepherd and a long-haired black dog. As to meet cattle on that road was nothing uncommon, and indeed they had met several droves in the course of the day, No remark was made at the moment, till suddenly each looked at the other and said, "What is become of the sheep?" Quite perplexed at their sudden disappearance, they called to the postilion to stop, and all got out in order to mount a little elevation and look around, but still unable to discover them. They now bethought themselves of asking the postilion where they were, when, to their infinite surprise, they learned that he had not seen them. Upon this, they bade him quicken his pace, that they might overtake a carriage that had passed them shortly before, and inquire if that party had seen the sheep, but they had not. 4 years later, a postmaster named J. was on the same road, driving a carriage in which were a clergyman and his wife, when he saw a large flock of sheep near the same spot. Seeing they were very fine wethers, and supposing them to have been bought at a sheep fair that was then taking place a few miles off, J. drew up his reins and stopped his horse, turning at the same time to the clergyman to say that he wanted to inquire the price of the sheep, as he intended going next day to the fair himself. While the minister was asking him what sheep he meant, J. got down and found himself in the midst of the animals, the size and beauty of which astonished him. They passed him at an unusual rate, while he made his way through them to find the shepherd, when, on getting to the end of the flock, they suddenly disappeared. He then first learned that his fellow travellers had not seen them at all. Now, if such cases as this are not pure illusions, which I confess I find it difficult to believe, we must suppose that the animals and all the extraneous circumstances are produced by the magical will of the spirit, either acting on the constructive imagination of the seers, or else actually constructing the ethereal forms out of the elements at its command, just as we have supposed an apparition able to present himself with whatever dress or appliances he conceives. Or else we must conclude these forms to have some relation to the mystery called palingenesia, which I have previously alluded to, although the motion and change of place render it difficult to bring them under this category. As for the animals, although the drover was lame, they were not, and therefore, even granting them to have souls, we cannot look upon them as the apparitions of the flock. Neither can we consider the numerous instances of armies seen in the air to be apparitions, and yet these phenomena are so well established that they have been accounted for by supposing them to be atmospherical reflections of armies elsewhere, in actual motion. But how are we to account for the visionary troops which are not seen in the air, but on the very ground on which the seers themselves stand, which was the case especially with those seen in Havre Park near Ripley in the year 1812? These soldiers wore a white uniform, and in the center was a personage in a scarlet one. After performing several revolutions, the body began to march in perfect order to the summit of a hill, passing the spectators at a distance of about 100 yards. They amounted to several hundreds, and marched in a column, 4 deep, across about 30 acres. And no sooner were they passed, than another body, far more numerous, but dressed in dark clothes, arose and marched after them, without any apparent hostility. Both parties having reached the top of the hill, and there formed what the spectators called an L, they disappeared down the other side, and were seen no more. But at that moment a volume of smoke arose like the discharge of a park of artillery, which was so thick that the men could not, for 2 or 3 minutes, discover their own cattle. They then hurried home to relate what they had seen, and the impression made on them is described as so great that they could never allude to the subject without emotion. One of them was a farmer of the name of Jackson, aged 45. The other was a lad of 15, called Turner, and they were at the time herding cattle in the park. The scene seems to have lasted nearly a quarter of an hour, during which time they were quite in possession of themselves, and able to make remarks to each other on what they saw. They were both men of excellent character and an impeccable veracity, and so much that nobody who knew them doubted that they actually saw what they described, or at all events believed that they did. It is so to be observed also that the ground is not swampy, nor subject to any exhalations. About the year 1750, a visionary army of the same description was seen in the neighbourhood of Inverness by a respectable farmer of Glenery and his son. The number of troops was very great, and they had not the slightest doubt that they were otherwise than substantial forms of flesh and blood. They counted at least 16 pairs of columns, and had abundance of time to observe every particular. The front ranks marched 7 abreast, and were accompanied by a good many women and children, who were carrying tin cans and other implements of cookery. The men were clothed in red, and their arms shone brightly in the sun. In the midst of them was an animal, a deer or a horse, they could not distinguish which, that they were driving furiously forward with their bayonets. The younger of the two men observed to the other that every now and then the rear ranks were obliged to run to overtake the van, and the elder one, who had been a soldier, remarked that was always the case, and recommended him, if he ever served, to try and march in the front. There was only one mounted officer. He rode a grey dragoon horse, and wore a gold-laced hat and blue hussar cloak, with wide, open sleeves lined with red. The two spectators observed him so particularly that they said afterward they should recognize him anywhere. They were, however, afraid of being ill-treated or forced to go along with the troops, whom they concluded had come from Ireland, and landed at Kintyre, and while they were climbing over a dike to get out of the way, the whole thing vanished. Some years since, a phenomenon of the same sort was observed at Paderborn in Westphalia, and seen by at least 30 persons, as well as by horses and dogs, as was discovered by the demeanor of these animals. In October 1836, on the very same spot, there was a review of 20,000 men, and the people then concluded that the former vision was a second sight. A similar circumstance occurred in Stockton Forest some years ago, and there are many recorded elsewhere, one specially in the year 1686, near Lanark, where for several afternoons in the months of June and July there were seen by numerous spectators companies of men in arms marching in order by the banks of the Clyde, and other companies meeting them, added to which they were showers of bonnets, hats, guns, swords, etc., which the seers described with the greatest exactness. All who were present could not see these things, and Walker relates that one gentleman particularly was turning the thing into ridicule, calling the seers damned witches and warlocks with a second sight, boasting that the devil a thing he could see, when he suddenly exclaimed, with fear and trembling, that he now saw it all, and entreated those who did not see to say nothing, a change that may be easily accounted for, be the phenomenon of what nature it may, by supposing him to have touched one of the seers, when the faculty would be communicated like a shock of electricity. With regard to the palingasia, it would be necessary to establish that these objects had previously existed, and that, as Oettinger says, the earthly husk having fallen off, the volatile essence had ascended perfect in form, but void of substance. The notion supported by Baron Reichenbach, that the lights seen in churchyards and over graves are the result of a process going on below, is by no means new, for Gaffarillus suggested the same opinion in 1650. Only he speaks of the appearances over graves and in churchyards as shadows, ombres, as they appeared to Billing, and he mentions casually a thing frequently observed, that the same visionary forms are remarked on the ground where battles have been fought, which he thinks arise out of a process between the earth and the sun. When a limb has been cut off, some somnambules still discern the form of the member as if actually attached. But this magical process is said to be not only the work of the elements, but also possible to man, as the forms of plants can be preserved after substance is destroyed, so can that of man be either preserved or reproduced from the elements of his body. In the reign of Louis XIV, 3 alchemists, having distilled some earth taken from the cemetery of the Innocents in Paris, were forced to desist by seeing the forms of men appearing in their vials instead of the philosopher's stone which they were seeking. And the physician, who after dissecting a body and pulverizing the cranium, which was then an article admitted into the Materia Medica, had left the powder on the table of his laboratory in charge of his assistant. The latter, who slept in an adjoining room, was awakened in the night by hearing a noise, which after some search he ultimately traced to the powder, in the midst of which he beheld, gradually constructed itself, a human form. First appeared the head, with 2 open eyes, then the arms and hands, and by degrees the rest of the person, which subsequently assumed the clothes it had worn when alive. The man was of course frightened out of his wits, the rather as the apparition planted itself before the door and would not let him go away till it had made its own exit, which it speedily did. Similar results have been said to arise from experiments performed on blood. I confess I should be disposed to consider these apparitions, if ever they appeared, cases of genuine ghosts brought into rapport by the operation rather than forms residing in the bones or blood. At all events, these things are very hard to believe, but seeing we were not there, I do not think we have any right to say they did not happen, or at least that some phenomena did not occur, that they were open to this interpretation. It is highly probable that the seeing of those visionary armies and similar prodigies is a sort of second sight, but having admitted this, we are very little nearer an explanation. Granting that, as in the above experiments, the essence of things may retain the forms of the substance, this does not explain the seeing that which has not yet taken place, or which is taking place at so great a distance that neither Oettinger's essence nor the superficial films of Lucretius can remove the difficulty. It is the fashion to say that second sight was a mere superstition of the Highlanders, and that no such thing is ever heard of now, but those who talk in this way know very little of the matter. No doubt, if they set out to look for seers, they may not find them. Such phenomena, though known in all countries and in all ages, are comparatively rare, as well as uncertain and capricious, and not to be exercised at will. But I know of too many instances of the existence of this faculty in families, as well as of isolated cases occurring to individuals above all suspicion, to entertain the smallest doubt of its reality. But the difficulty of furnishing evidence is considerable, because when the seers are of the humble classes, they are called impostors and not believed, and when they are of the higher, they do not make the subject a matter of conversation, nor choose to expose themselves to the ridicule of the foolish, and consequently the thing is not known beyond their own immediate friends. When the young Duke of Orleans was killed, a lady residing here saw the accident and described it to her husband at the time it was occurring in France. She had frequently seen the Duke when on the continent. Captain N went to stay 2 days at the house of Lady T. After dinner, however, he announced that he was under the necessity of going away that night, nor could he be induced to remain. On being much pressed for an explanation, he confided to some of the party that, during the dinner, he had seen a female figure with her throat cut, standing behind Lady T's chair. Of course, it was thought an illusion, but Lady T was not told of it, lest she should be alarmed. That night, the household was called up for the purpose of summoning a surgeon. Lady T had cut her own throat. Mr. C, who though a Scotchman was an entire skeptic with regard to the second sight, was told by a seer whom he had been jeering on the subject, that within a month he, Mr. C, would be a pall-bearer at a funeral, that he would go by a certain road, but that, before they had crossed the brook, a man in a drab coat would come down the hill and take the pall from him. The funeral occurred, Mr. C was a bearer, and they went by the road described, but he firmly resolved that he would disappoint the seer by keeping the pall while they crossed the brook. But shortly before they reached it, the postman overtook them with letters, which in that part of the country arrived but twice a week, and Mr. C, who was engaged in some speculations of importance, turned to receive them, at which moment the pall was taken from him, and on looking round, he saw it was by a man in a drab coat. A medical friend of mine, who practised some time at Deptford, was once sent for to a girl who had been taken suddenly ill. He found her with inflammation of the brain, and the only account the mother could give of it was that, shortly before, she had run into the room, crying, "Oh, mother, I have seen Uncle John drowned in his boat under the 5th arch of Rochester Bridge." The girl died a few hours afterward, and on the following night the uncle's boat ran foul of the bridge, and he was drowned, exactly as she had foretold. Mrs. A, an English lady, and the wife of a clergyman, relates that, previous to her marriage, she, with her father and mother being at the seaside, had arranged to make a few days' excursion to some races that were about to take place, and that the night before they started, the father having been left alone while the ladies were engaged with their preparations, they found him, on descending to the drawing-room, in a state of considerable agitation, which, he said, had arisen from his having seen a dreadful face at one corner of the room. He described it as a bruised, battered, crushed, discoloured face, with the 2 eyes protruding frightfully from their sockets. But the features were too disfigured to ascertain if it were the face of anyone he knew. On the following day, on their way to the races, an accident occurred, and he was brought home with his own face exactly in the condition he had described. He had never exhibited any other instance of this extraordinary faculty, and the impression made by the circumstance lasted the remainder of his life, which was unhappily shortened by the injuries he had received. The late Mrs. V., a lady of fortune and family, who resides near Loch Lomond, possessed this faculty in an extraordinary degree, and displayed it on many remarkable occasions. When her brother was shipwrecked in the Channel, she was heard to exclaim, "Thank God he's saved," and describe the scene with all its circumstances. Colonel David Stewart, a determined believer in what he calls the supernatural, in his book on the Highlanders, relates the following fact as one so remarkable that credulous minds may be excused for believing it to have been prophetic. He says that, late in an autumnal evening of the year 1773, the son of a neighbor came to his father's house, and soon after his arrival inquired for a little boy of the family, then about 3 years old. He was shown up to the nursery, and found the nurse putting a pair of new shoes on the child, which she complained did not fit. "Never mind," said the young man, "they'll fit him before he wants them." A prediction which not only offended the nurse, but seemed at the moment absurd, since the child was apparently in perfect health. When he joined the party in the drawing-room, he being much jeered upon his new gift of second sight, explained that the impression he had received originated in his having just seen a funeral passing the wooden bridge which crossed the stream at a short distance from the house. He first observed a crowd of people, and on coming near he saw a person carrying a small coffin, followed by about 20 gentlemen, all of his acquaintance, his own father and a Mr. Stewart being among the number. He did not attempt to join the procession, which he saw turn off into the churchyard, but knowing his own father could not be actually there, and that Mr. and Mrs. Stewart were then at Blair, he felt a conviction that the phenomenon portended the death of the child, a persuasion which was verified by its suddenly expiring on the following night. And Colonel Stewart adds that the circumstances and attendance at the funeral were precisely such as the young man had described. He mentions also that this gentleman was not a seer, that he was a man of education and general knowledge, and that this was the first and only vision of the sort he had ever had. I know of a young lady who has 3 times seen funerals in this way. The old persuasion that fasting was a means of developing the spirit of prophecy is undoubtedly well-founded, and the annals of medicine furnish numerous facts which establish it. A man condemned to death at Viterbo, having abstained from food in the hope of escaping execution, became so clairvoyant that he could tell what was doing in any part of the prison. The expression used in the report is that he saw through the walls. This, however, could not be with his natural organs of sight. It is worthy of observation that idiots often possess some glimpse of this faculty of second sight or presentiment, and it's probably on this account that they are in some countries held sacred. Presentiment, which I think may very probably be merely the vague and imperfect recollection of what we knew in our sleep, is often observed in drunken people. In the Great Plague at Basel, which occurred toward the end of the 16th century, almost everybody who died called out in their last moments the name of the person that was to follow them next. Not long ago, a servant girl on the state of D of S saw with amazement 5 figures ascending a perpendicular cliff, quite inaccessible to human feet. One was a boy wearing a cap with red binding. She watched them with great curiosity till they reached the top, where they all stretched themselves on the earth, with countenances expressive of great dejection. While she was looking at them, they disappeared, and she immediately related her vision. Shortly afterward, a foreign ship in distress was seen to put off a boat with 4 men and a boy. The boat was dashed to pieces in the surf, and the 5 bodies, exactly answering the description she had given, were thrown on shore at the foot of the cliff, which they had perhaps climbed in the spirit. How well what we call clairvoyance was known, though how little understood, at the period of the witch persecution, is proved by what Dr. Henry Moore says in his Antidote against Atheism. We will now pass to those supernatural effects which are observed in them that are bewitched or possessed, and such as of foretelling things to come, telling what such and such persons speak or do, as exactly as if they were by them, when the party possessed is at one end of the town, and sitting in a house within doors, and those parties that act and comfort together are without at the other end of the town. To be able to see some and not others, to play at cards with one certain person, and not to discern anybody else at the table beside him, to act and talk, and go up and down, and tell what will become of things, and what happens in those fits of possession, and then, as soon as the possessed or bewitched party is out of them, to remember nothing at all, but to inquire concerning the welfare of those whose faces they seemed to look upon just before, when they were in their fits, a state which he believes to arise from the devils having taken possession of the body of the magnetic person, which is precisely the theory supported by many fanatical persons in our own day. Dr. Moore was not a fanatic, but this phenomena, though very well understood by the ancient philosophers, as well as by Paracelsus, Van Helmont, Cornelius Agrippa, Jacob Behmen, a Scotch physician called Maxwell, who published on the subject in the 17th century, and many others, were still, when observed, looked upon as the effects of diabolical influence by mankind in general. When Monsieur Sixteniers, the artist, was drowned in the Seine in 1846, after his body had been vainly sought, a somnambule was applied to, in whose hands they placed a portfolio belonging to him, and being asked where the owner was, she evinced great terror, held up her dress as if walking in the water, and said that he was between two boats, under the Pont des Arts, with nothing on but a flannel waistcoat, and there he was found. A friend of mine knows a lady who early one morning, being in a natural state of clairvoyance without magnetism, saw the porter of the house where her son lodged ascend to his room with a carving knife, go to his bed where he lay asleep, lean over him, then open a chest, take out a 50-pound note, and retire. On the following day, she went to her son and asked him if he had any money in the house. He said, "Yes, I have 50 pounds," whereupon she bade him seek it, but it was gone. They stopped payment of the note, but did not prosecute, thinking the evidence insufficient. Subsequently, the porter being taken up for other crimes, the note was found crumpled up at the bottom of an old purse belonging to him. Dr. Anna Moser says that there is no doubt of the ancient Sibyls having been clairvoyant women, and that it is impossible so much value could have been attached to their books, had not their revelations been verified. A maid-servant, residing in a family in Northumberland, one day last winter was heard to utter a violent scream immediately after she had left the kitchen. On following her to inquire what had happened, she said that she had just seen her father in his night clothes, with a most horrible countenance, and she was sure something dreadful had happened to him. 2 days afterward there arrived a letter, saying he had been seized with delirium tremens, and was at the point of death, which accordingly ensued. There are innumerable cases of this sort recorded in various collections, not to mention the much more numerous ones that meet with no recorder, and I could myself mention many more, but this will suffice. One, however, I will not omit, for, though historical, it's not generally known. A year before the rebellion broke out, in consequence of which Lord Kilmarnock lost his head, the family were one day startled by a scream, and on rushing out to inquire what had occurred, they found the servants all assembled in amazement, with the exception of one maid, who they said had gone up to the garrets to hang some linen on the lines to dry. On ascending thither, they found the girl on the floor, in a state of insensibility, and they had no sooner revived her than, on seeing Lord Kilmarnock bending over her, she screamed and fainted again. When ultimately recovered, she told them that while hanging up her linen and singing, the door had burst open and his lordship's bloody head had rolled in. I think it came twice. This event was so well known at the time that on the first rumours of the rebellion, Lord Salton said, "Kilmarnock will lose his head." It was answered that Kilmarnock had not joined the rebels. "He will, and will be beheaded," returned Lord Salton. Now, in these cases, we are almost compelled to believe that the phenomenon is purely subjective, and there is no veritable outstanding object seen. Yet, when we have taken refuge in this hypothesis, the difficulty remains as great as ever, and is to me much more incomprehensible than ghost-seeing, because in the latter we suppose an external agency acting in some way or other on the seer. I have already mentioned that Oberlin, the good pastor of Bain de la Roche, himself a ghost-seer, asserted that everything earthly had its counterpart, or antitype, in the other world, not only organized but unorganized matter. If so, do we sometimes see these antitypes? Dr. Anna Moser, in treating of second sight, which by the way is quite as well known in Germany, and especially in Denmark as in the highlands of Scotland, says that as in natural somnambulism there is a partial internal vigilance, so does the seer fall, while awake, into a dream state. He suddenly becomes motionless and stiff. His eyes are open and his senses are, while the vision lasts, unperceptive of all external objects. The vision may be communicated by the touch, and sometimes persons at a distance from each other, but connected by blood or sympathy, have the vision simultaneously. He remarks also that, as we have seen in the above case of Mr. C, any attempt to frustrate the fulfillment of the vision never succeeds, inasmuch as the attempt appears to be taken into the account. The seeing in glass and in crystals is equally inexplicable, as is the magical seeing of the Egyptians. Every now and then we hear it said that this last is discovered to be an imposition, because some traveller has either actually fallen into the hands of an impostor, and there are impostors in all trades, or because the phenomenon was imperfectly exhibited, a circumstance which, as the exhibitions of clairvoyants and somnambulists, where all the conditions are not under command, or even recognized, must necessarily happen. But not to mention the accounts published by Mr. Lane in Lord Prudhoe, whoever has read that of Monsieur Léon Laborde must be satisfied that the thing is an indisputable fact. It is in fact only another form of the seeing in crystals which has been known in all ages, and of which many modern instances have occurred among somnambulic patients. We see by the 44th chapter of Genesis that it was by his cup that Joseph prophesied. Is not this it in which my Lord drinketh, and whereby indeed he divineth? But, as Dr. Passavant observes, and as we shall presently see, in the anecdote of the boy and the gypsy, the virtue does not lie in the glass nor in the water, but in the seer himself, who may possess a more or less developed faculty. The external objects and ceremonies being only the means of concentrating the attention and intensifying the power. Monsieur Léon Laborde witnessed the exhibition at Cairo before Lord P.'s visit. The exhibitor, named Ahmed, appeared to him a respectable man, who spoke simply of his science, and had nothing of the charlatan about him. The first child employed was a boy 11 years old, the son of a European, and Ahmed, having traced some figures on the palm of his hand, and poured ink over them, bade him look for the reflection of his own face. The child said he saw it. The magician then burnt some powders in a brazier, and bade him tell him when he saw a soldier sweeping a place, and while the fumes from the brazier diffused themselves, he pronounced a sort of litany. Presently the child threw back his head, and screaming with terror, sobbed out, while bathed in tears, that he had seen a dreadful face. Fearing the boy might be injured, Monsieur Laborde now called up a little Arab servant, who had never seen or heard of the magician. He was gay and laughing, and not at all frightened, and the ceremony being repeated, he said he saw the soldier sweeping in the front of a tent. He was then desired to bid the soldier bring Shakespeare, Colonel Cradock, and several other persons, and he described every person and thing so exactly as to be entirely satisfactory. During the operations the boy looked as if intoxicated, with his eyes fixed and the perspiration dripping from his brow. Ahmed disenchanted him by placing his thumbs on his eyes. He gradually recovered, and gaily related all he had seen, which he perfectly remembered. Now, this is merely another form of what the Laplanders, the African magicians, and the shamans of Siberia do by taking narcotics and turning round till they fall down in a state of insensibility, in which condition they are clear seers, and besides vaticinating, describe scenes, places, and persons they have never seen. In Barbary, they anoint their hands with a black ointment, and then holding them up in the sun, they see whatever they desire, like the Egyptians. Lady S possesses somewhat of a singular faculty, naturally. By walking rapidly round a room several times, till a certain degree of vertigo is produced, she will name to you any person you have privately thought of or agreed upon with others. Her phrase is, I see, so and so. Monsieur Laborde purchased the secret of Ahmed, who said he had learned it from two celebrated sheiks of his own country, which was Algiers. Monsieur L found it connected with both physics and magnetism, and practiced it himself afterward with perfect success. And he affirms positively that under the influence of a particular organization and certain ceremonies, among which he cannot distinguish which are indispensable and which are not, that a child, without fraud or collusion, can see, as through a window or peephole, people moving, who appear and disappear at their command, and with whom they hold communication, and they remember everything after the operation. He says, I narrate, but explain nothing. I produce those effects, but cannot comprehend them. I only affirm in the most positive manner that what I relate is true. I perform the experiment in various places, with various subjects, before numerous witnesses, in my own room or other rooms, in the open air, and even in a boat on the Nile. The exactitude and detailed descriptions of persons, places, and scenes could by no possibility be feigned. Moreover, Baron Dupotet has very lately succeeded in obtaining this phenomena in Paris, from persons not somnambulic selected from his audience. The chief difference being that they did not recollect what they had seen when the crisis was over. Cagliostro, though a charlatan, was possessed of his secret, and it was his great success in it that chiefly sustained his reputation. The spectators, convinced he could make children see distant places and persons in glass, were persuaded he could do other things, which appeared to them no more mysterious. Dr. D was perfectly honest with regard to his mirror, in which he could see by concentrating his mind on it, but as he could not remember what he saw, he employed Kelly to see for him, while he himself wrote down the revelations, and Kelly was a rogue, and deceived and ruined him. A friend of Pfeffel's knew a boy, apprenticed to an apothecary at Schopenhauer, who, having been observed to amuse himself by looking into vials filled with water, was asked what he saw, when it was discovered that he possessed this faculty of seeing in glass, which was afterward very frequently exhibited for the satisfaction of the curious. Pfeffel also mentions another boy who had this faculty, and who went about the country with a small mirror, answering questions, recovering stolen goods, etc. He said that he one day fell in with some gypsies, one of whom was sitting apart and staring into his glass. The boy, from curiosity, looked over his shoulder and exclaimed that he saw a fine man who was moving about, whereupon the gypsy, having interrogated him, gave him the glass. "For," said he, "I have been staring it long enough, and can see nothing but my own face." It is almost unnecessary to observe that the sacred books of the Jews and of the Indians testify to their acquaintance with this mode of divination, as well as many others. Many persons will have heard or read an account of Mr. Canning and Mr. Huskinson having seen, while in Paris, the visionary representation of their own deaths in water, as exhibited to them by a Russian or Polish lady there. As I do not, however, know what authority there is for this story, I will not insist on it here. But Saint Simon relates a very curious circumstance of this nature, which occurred at Paris, and was related to him by the Duke of Orleans, afterward regent. The latter said that he had sent on the preceding evening for a man, then in Paris, who pretended to exhibit whatever was desired in a glass of water. He came, and a child of 7 years old, belonging to the house, being called up, they bade her tell what she saw doing in certain places. She did, and as they sent to these places and found her report correct, they bade her next describe under what circumstances the king would die, without, however, asking when the death would take place. The child knew none of the court, and had never been at Versailles. Yet she described everything exactly, the room, bed, furniture, and the king himself, Madame de Maintenon, Fagon, the physician, the princes and princesses, everybody, in short, including a child, wearing an order in the arms of a lady whom she recognized at having seen. This was Madame de Ventadour. It was remarkable that she omitted the Dukes de Bourgogne and Berry, and Monsieur, and also the Duchess de Bourgogne. Orleans insisted they must be there, describing them, but she always said no. These persons were then all well, but they died before the king. She also saw the children of the Prince and Princess of Conti, but not themselves, which was correct, as they also died shortly after this occurrence. Orleans then wished to see his own destiny, and the man said if he would not be frightened he could show it to him, as if painted on the wall, and after 15 minutes of conjuration the Duke appeared, of the natural size, dressed as usual, but with a couronne fermée, or closed crown on his head, which they could not comprehend, as it was not that of any country they knew of. It covered his head, and only 4 circles, and nothing at the top. They had never seen such one. When he became regent, they understood that that was the interpretation of the prediction. In connection with this subject, the aversion to glass frequently manifested by dogs is well worthy of observation. When facts of this kind are found to be recorded or believed in, In all parts of the world, from the beginning of it up to the present time, it is surely vain for the so-called savants to deny them, and, as Cicero justly says in describing the different kinds of magic, what we have to do with is the facts, since of the cause we know little. Neither, he adds, are we to repudiate these phenomena, because we sometimes find them imperfect, or even false, any more than we are to distrust that the human eye sees, although some do this very imperfectly, or not at all. We are part spirit and part matter. By the former we are allied to the spiritual world and to the absolute spirit. And as nobody doubts that the latter can work magically, that is, for by the mere act of will all things were created, and by its constant exertion all things are sustained, why should we be astonished that we, who partake of the divine nature and were created after God's own image, should also, within certain limits, partake of this magical power? That this power has been frequently abused is the fault of those who, being capable, refuse to investigate, and deny the existence of this and similar phenomena, and by thus casting them out of the region of legitimate science, leave them to become the prey of the ignorant and designing. Dr. Ennemoser, in his very learned work on magic, shows us that all the phenomena of magnetism and somnambulism, and all the various kinds of divination, have been known and practiced in every country under the sun, and have been intimately connected with, and indeed may be traced up to the fountainhead of every religion. What are the limits of these powers possessed by us while in the flesh? How far they may be developed, and whether, at the extreme verge of what we can effect, we begin to be aided by God or by spirits of other spheres of existence bordering on ours? We know not, but with respect to the morality of these practices, it suffices that what is good in act or intention must come of good, and what is evil in act or intention must come of evil, which is true now, as it was in the time of Moses and the prophets, when miracles and magic were used for purposes holy and unholy, and were to be judged accordingly. God works by natural laws, of which we yet know very little, and in some departments of his kingdom nothing. And whatever appears to us supernatural only appears so from our ignorance. And whatever faculties or powers he has endowed us with, it must have been designed we should exercise and cultivate for the benefit and advancement of our race. Nor can I for one moment suppose that, though like everything else, liable to abuse, the legitimate exercise of these powers, if we knew their range, would be useless, much less pernicious or sinful. Of the magical power of will, as I have said before, we know nothing, and it does not belong to a purely rationalistic age to acknowledge what it cannot understand. In all countries men have arisen, here and there, who have known it, and some traces of it have survived both in language and in popular superstitions. If you have faith as a grain of mustard seed, you shall say unto this mountain, Remove hence, and it shall remove, and nothing shall be impossible to you. Howbeit, this kind goeth not out by prayer and fasting. And voyez et croyez, will and believe, was the solution Paezra gave of his magical cures, and no doubt the explanation of those affected by royal hands is to be found in the fact that they believed in themselves, and having faith they could exercise will. But with the belief in the divine right of kings, the faith and the power would naturally expire together. With respect to what Christ says, in the above-quoted passage, of fasting, numerous instances are extant, proving that clear seeing and other magical or spiritual powers are sometimes developed by it. William Crowe, a doctor of philosophy and a lecturer at Jena, who died during the prevalence of the cholera, cultivated these powers and preached them. I have not been able to obtain his works, they being suppressed as far as is practicable by the Prussian government. Crowe could leave his body, and to all appearance die whenever he pleased. One of his disciples, yet living, Count von Aberstein, possesses the same faculty. Many writers of the 16th century were well acquainted with the power of will, and to this was attributed the good or evil influence of blessings and curses. They believed it to be of great effect in curing diseases, and that by it alone life might be extinguished. That, subjectively, life may be extinguished, we have seen by the cases of Colonel Townshend, the dervish that was buried, Hermotinus, and others. For doubtless the power that could perform so much could, under an adequate motive, have performed more, and since all things in nature, spiritual and material, are connected, and that there is an unceasing interaction between them, we being members of one great whole, only individualized by our organisms, it is possible to conceive that the power which can be exerted on our own organism might be extended to others. And since we cannot conceive man to be an isolated being, the only intelligence besides God, none above us and none below, but must, on the contrary, believe that there are numerous grades of intelligences, it seems to follow, of course, that we must stand in some kind of relation to them, more or less intimate. Nor is it at all surprising that with some individuals this relation should be more intimate than with others. Finally, we are not entitled to deny the existence of this magical or spiritual power as exerted by either incorporated or unincorporated spirits, because we do not comprehend how it can be exerted, since, in spite of all the words that have been expended on the subject, we are equally ignorant of the mode in which our own will acts upon our own muscles. We know the fact, but not the mode of it. End of chapter 17. Recording by Liana Leite.
Section 27 of the Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers, by Crowe. Chapter 18. Conclusion. Of the power of the mind over matter we have a remarkable example in the numerous well-authenticated instances of the stigmata. As in most cases, this phenomenon has been connected with a state of religious exaltation, and has been appropriated by the Roman Church as a miracle. The fact has been in this country pretty generally discredited, but without reason. Moser, Paezra, Schubert, and other eminent German physiologists assure us that not only is the fact perfectly established, as regards many of the so-called saints, but also that there have been indubitable modern instances, as in the case of the ecstaticus of the Tyrol, Catherine Emmerich, commonly called the Nun of Dolman, Maria Morel, and Domenica Lazzari, who have all exhibited the stigmata. Catherine Emmerich, the most remarkable of the three, began very early to have visions and to display unusual endowments. She was very pious, could distinguish the qualities of plants, reveal secrets or distant circumstances, and knew people's thoughts, but was, however, extremely sickly, and exhibited a variety of extraordinary and distressing symptoms, which terminated in her death. The wounds of the crown of thorns round her head and those of the nails in her hands and feet were as perfect as if painted by an artist, and they bled regularly on Fridays. There was also a double cross on her breast. When the blood was wiped away, the marks looked like the puncture of flies. She seldom took any nourishment but water, and having been but a poor cow-keeper, she discoursed when in the ecstatic state as if inspired. I am well aware that on reading this many persons who never saw her will say it was all imposture. It is very easy to say this, but it is as absurd as presumptuous to pronounce on what they have no opportunity of observing. I never saw these women either, but I find myself much more disposed to accept the evidence of those who did, than of those who only do not believe because they do not believe. Neither Catherine Emmerich nor the others made their sufferings a source of profit, nor had they any desire to be exhibited, but quite the contrary. She could see in the dark as well as the light, and frequently worked all night at making clothes for the poor without lamp or candle. There have been instances of magnetic patients being stigmatized in this manner. Madame B. von N. dreamed one night that a person offered her a red and white rose, and that she chose the latter. On awakening she felt a burning pain in her arm, and by degrees there arose there the figure of a rose, perfect in form and color. It was rather raised above the skin. The mark increased in intensity till the 8th day, after which it faded away, and by the 14th was no longer perceptible. A letter from Moscow, addressed to Dr. Kerner in consequence of reading the account of the Nun of Dolman, relates a still more extraordinary case. At the time of the French invasion, a Cossack having pursued a Frenchman into a cul-de-sac, an alley without an outlet, There ensued a terrible conflict between them, in which the latter was severely wounded. A person who had taken refuge in this close and could not get away was so dreadfully frightened that when he reached home there broke out on his body the very same wounds that the Cossack had inflicted on his enemy. The signatures of the fetus are analogous facts, and if the mind of the mother can thus act on another organism, why not the minds of the saints or of Catherine Emmerich on their own? From the influence of the mother on the child, we have but one step to that asserted to be possible between two organisms not visibly connected. For the difficulty therein lies, that we do not see the link that connects them, though doubtless it exists. Dr. Blacklock, who lost his eyesight at an early period, said that when awake he distinguished persons by hearing and feeling them, but when asleep he had a distinct impression of another sense. He then seemed to himself united to them by a kind of distant contact, which was effected by threads passing from their bodies to his, which seems to be but a metaphorical expression of the fact. For whether the connection be maintained by an all-pervading ether, or be purely dynamic, that the interaction exists between both organic and inorganic bodies is made evident wherever there is sufficient excitability to render the effect sensible. Till very lately the powers of the divining rod were considered a mere fable. Yet that this power exists, though not in the rod, but in the person that holds it, is now perfectly well established. Count Tristan, who has written a book on the subject, says that about 1 in 40 have it, and that a complete course of experiments has proved the phenomenon to be electric. The rod seems to serve in some degree the same purpose as the magical mirror in conjurations, and it is also serviceable in presenting a result visible to the eye of the spectator. But numerous cases are met with in which metals or water are perceived beneath the surface of the earth without the intervention of the rod. A man called Bleton from Dauphiny possessed this divining power in a remarkable degree, as did a Swiss girl called Catherine Beutler. She was strong and healthy and of a phlegmatic temperament, yet so susceptible of these influences that without the rod she pointed out and traced the course of water, veins of metal, coal beds, salt mines, etc. The sensations produced were sometimes on the soles of her feet, sometimes on her tongue or in her stomach. She never lost the power wholly, but it varied considerably in intensity at different times, as it did with Bleton. She was also rendered sensible of the bodily pains of others by laying her hand on the affected part or near it, and she performed several magnetic cures. A person now alive named Desange, in the Macons, possessed this power. He is a simple, honest man who can give no account of his own faculty. The Abbés Chillard and Paramel can also discover subterraneous springs, but they say it is effected by means of their geological science. M. D. of Cluny, however, found the faculty of Desange much more to be relied on. The Greeks and Romans made hydroscopy an art, and there are works alluded to as having existed on this subject, especially one by Marcellus. The caduceus of Mercury, the wand of Circe, and the wands of the Egyptian sorcerers show that the wand or rod was always looked upon as a symbol of divination. One of the most remarkable instances of the use of the divining rod is that of Jacques Aymar. On the 5th of July, 1692, a man and his wife were murdered in a cellar at Lyons, and their house was robbed. Having no clue whatever to the criminal, this peasant, who had the reputation of being able to discover murderers, thieves, and stolen articles by means of the divining rod, was sent for from Dauphiny. Aymar undertook to follow the footsteps of the assassins, but he said he must first be taken into the cellar where the murder was committed. The Procurator Royal conducted him thither, and they gave him a rod out of the first wood that came to hand. He walked about the cellar, but the rod did not move till he came to the spot where the man had been killed. Then Aymar became agitated, and his pulse beat as if he were in a high fever, and all these symptoms were augmented when he approached the spot on which they had found the body of the woman. From this, he, of his own accord, went into a sort of shop where the robbery had been committed. Thence he proceeded into the street, tracing the assassin step by step, first to the court of the Archbishop's palace, then out of the city and along the right side of the river. He was escorted all the way by 3 persons appointed for the purpose, who all testified that sometimes he detected the traces of 3 accomplices, sometimes only of 2. He led the way to the house of a gardener, where he insisted that they had touched a table, and one of 3 bottles that were yet standing upon it. It was at first denied. but 2 children of 9 or 10 years old said that 3 men had been there and had been served with wine in that bottle. Aymar then traced them to the river, where they had embarked in a boat, and what is very extraordinary, he tracked them as surely on the water as on the land. He followed them wherever they had gone ashore, went straight to the places they had lodged at, pointed out their beds and the very utensils of every description that they had used. On arriving at Sablon, where some troops were encamped, the rod and his own sensations satisfied him that the assassins were there, but fearing the soldiers would ill-treat him, he refused to pursue the enterprise further, and returned to Lyons. He was, however, promised protection, and sent back by water with letters of recommendation. On reaching Sablon, he said they were no longer there, but he tracked them into the Languedoc, entering every house they had stopped at, till he at length reached the gates of the prison, and in the town of Beaucaire, where he said one of them would be found. They brought all the prisoners before him, amounting to 15, and the only one his rod turned on was a little bossu, or deformed man, who had just been brought in for a petty theft. He then ascertained that the 2 others had taken the road to Nimes, and offered to follow them, but as the man denied all knowledge of the murder, and declared he had never been at Lyons, it was thought best that they should return there, and as they went the way they had come, and stopped at the same houses where he was recognized, he at length confessed that he had travelled with 2 men who had engaged him to assist in the crime. What is very remarkable, it was found necessary that Jacques Aymar should walk in front of the criminal, for when he followed him he became violently sick. From Lyons to Beaucaire is 45 miles. As the confession of the bossu confirmed all Aymar had asserted, the affair now created an immense sensation, and a great variety of experiments were instituted, every one of which proved perfectly satisfactory. Moreover, 2 gentlemen, one of them the controller of the customs, were discovered to possess this faculty, though in a minor degree. They now took Aymar back to Beaucaire, that he might trace the other 2 criminals, and he went straight again to the prison gate, where he said that now another would be found. On inquiry, however, it was discovered that a man had been there to inquire for the bossu, but was gone again. He then followed them to Toulon, and finally to the frontier of Spain, which set a limit to further researches. He was often so faint and overcome with the effluvia, or whatever it was that guided him, that the perspiration streamed from his brow, and they were obliged to sprinkle him with water to prevent his fainting. He detected many robberies in the same way. His rod moved whenever he passed over metals or water or stolen goods, but he found that he could distinguish the track of a murderer from all the rest by the horror and pain he felt. He made this discovery accidentally as he was searching for water. They dug up the ground and found the body of a woman that had been strangled. I have myself met with 3 or 4 persons in whose hands the rod turned visibly, and there are numerous very remarkable cases recorded in different works. In the Harz there is a race of people who support themselves entirely by this sort of divination, and as they are paid very highly and do nothing else, they are generally extremely worthless and dissipated. The extraordinary susceptibility to atmospheric changes in certain organisms, and the faculty by which a dog tracks the foot of his master, are analogous facts to those of the divining rod. Mr. Boyle mentions a lady who always perceived if a person that visited her came from a place where snow had lately fallen. I have seen one who, if a quantity of gloves are given her, can tell to a certainty to whom each belongs, and a particular friend of my own, on entering a room, can distinguish perfectly who has been sitting in it, provided these be persons he is familiarly acquainted with. Numerous extraordinary stories are extant respecting this kind of faculty in dogs. Doubtless not only our bodies but all matter sheds its atmosphere around it. The sterility of the ground where metals are found is notorious, and it is asserted that to some persons the vapors that emanate from below are visible, and that as the height of the mountains round a lake furnishes a measure of its depth, so does the height to which these vapors ascend show how far below the surface the mineral treasures or waters lie. The effect of metals on somnambulic persons is well known to all who have paid any attention to these subjects, and surely may be admitted when it is remembered that Humboldt has discovered the same sensibility in zoophytes, where no traces of nerves could be detected, and many years ago Frascatorius asserted that symptoms resembling apoplexy were sometimes induced by the proximity of a large quantity of metal. A gentleman is mentioned who could not enter the Mint at Paris without fainting. In short, so many well-attested cases of idiosyncratic sensibilities exist, that we have no right to reject others because they appear incomprehensible. Now we may not only easily conceive, but we know it to be a fact, that fear, grief, and other detrimental passions vitiate the secretions. Footnote: in the medical annals a case is recorded of a young lady whose axillary excretions were rendered so offensive by the fright and horror she had experienced in seeing some of her relations assassinated in India, that she was unable to go into society. End footnote. And augment transpiration, and it is quite natural to suppose that, where a crime has been committed which necessarily aroused a number of turbulent emotions, exhalations perceptible to a very acute sense may for some time hover over the spot, while the anxiety, the terror, the haste, in short, the general commotion of system that must accompany a murderer in his flight, is quite sufficient to account for his path being recognizable by such an abnormal faculty. For the wicked flee when no man pursueth. We also know that a person perspiring with open pores is more susceptible than another to contagion, and we have only to suppose the pores of Jacques Aymar so constituted as easily to imbibe the emanations shed by the fugitive, and we see why he should be affected by the disagreeable sensations he describes. The disturbing effect of odors on some persons, which are quite innoxious to others, must have been observed by everybody. Some people do actually almost die of a rose and aromatic pain. Boyle says that in his time many physicians avoided giving drugs to children, having found that external applications to be imbibed by the skin or by respiration were sufficient, and the homeopaths occasionally use the same means now. Sir Charles Bell told me that Mr. F., a gentleman well known in public life, had only to hold an old book to his nose to produce all the effects of a cathartic. Elizabeth Okey was oppressed with most painful sensations when near a person whose frame was sinking. Whenever this effect was of a certain intensity, Dr. Elliotson observed that the patient invariably died. Herein lies the secret of amulets and talismans, which grew to be a vain superstition, but in which, as in all popular beliefs, there was a germ of truth. Somnambulic persons frequently prescribe them, and absurd as it may seem to many, there are instances in which their efficacy has been perfectly established, be the interpretation of the mystery what it may. In a great plague which occurred in Moravia, a physician who was constantly among the sufferers attributed the complete immunity of himself and his family to their wearing amulets composed of the powder of toads, which, says Boyle, caused an emanation adverse to the contagion. A Dutch physician mentions that in the plague at Nijmegen, the pest seldom attacked any house till they had used soap in washing their linen. Wherever this was done, it appeared immediately. In short, we are the subjects, and so is everything around us, of all manner of subtle and inexplicable influences. And if our ancestors attached too much importance to these ill-understood arcana of the night side of nature, we have attached too little. The sympathetic effects of multitudes upon each other, of the young sleeping with the old, of magnetism on plants and animals, are now acknowledged facts. May not many other asserted phenomena that we yet laugh at be facts also, though probably too capricious in their nature, by which I mean depending on laws beyond our apprehension, to be very available? For I take it that as there is no such thing as chance, but all would be certainty if we knew the whole of the conditions, so no phenomena are really capricious and uncertain. They only appear so to our ignorance and short-sightedness. The strong belief that formerly prevailed in the efficacy of sympathetic cures can scarcely have existed, I think, without some foundation, nor are they a whit more extraordinary than the sympathetic falling of pictures and stopping of clocks and watches, of which such numerous well-attested cases are extant, that several learned German physiologists of the present day pronounce the thing indisputable. I have myself heard of some very perplexing instances. Gavrillis alludes to a certain sort of magnet, not resembling iron, but of a black and white color, with which, if a needle or knife were rubbed, the body might be punctured or cut without pain. How can we know that this is not true? Jugglers who slashed and cauterized their bodies for the amusement of the public were supposed to avail themselves of such secrets. How is it possible for us either to imagine that the numerous recorded cases of the blood ordeal, which consisted in the suspected assassin touching the body of his victim, can have been either pure fictions or coincidences? Not very long ago an experiment of a frightful nature is said to have been tried in France on a somnambulic person by placing on the epigastric region a vial filled with the arterial blood of a criminal just guillotined. The effect asserted to have been produced was the establishment of a rapport between the somnambule and the deceased which endangered the life of the former. Franz von Baader suggests the hypothesis of a vis sanguinis ultra mortem, and supposes that a rapport or communio vitae may be established between the murderer and his victim, and he conceives the idea of this mutual relation to be the true interpretation of the sacrificial rites common to all countries, as also of the Blutschuld, or the requiring blood for blood. With regard to the blood ordeal, the following are two latest instances of it recorded to have taken place in this country. They are extracted from Hargrave's State Trials. Evidence having been given with respect to the death of Jane Norcott, an ancient and grave person, minister of the parish in Herefordshire, where the murder took place, being sworn, deposed that the body being taken up out of the grave and the four defendants being present, were required each of them to touch the dead body. Okerman's wife fell upon her knees and prayed God to show her token of her innocency. The appellant did touch the body, whereupon the brow of the deceased, which was before of a livid and carrion color, began to have a dew, or gentle sweat on it, which increased by degrees till the sweat ran down in drops on the face. The brow turned to a lively and fresh color, and the deceased opened one of her eyes and shut it again. And this opening the eye was done 3 several times. She likewise thrust out the ring or marriage finger 3 times, and pulled it in again, and blood dropped from the finger on the grass. Sir Nicholas Hyde, the Chief Justice, seeming to doubt this evidence, he asked the witness, who saw these things besides him? To which he, the witness, answered, My lord, I cannot swear what others saw, but I do believe the whole company saw it, and if it had been thought a doubt, proof would have been made, and many would have attested with me. My lord, added the witness, observing the surprise his evidence awakened, I am minister of the parish, and have long known all the parties, but never had the displeasure against any of them, nor they with me, but as I was minister. The thing was wonderful to me, but I have not interest in the matter, except as called on to testify to the truth. My lord, my brother, who is minister of the next parish, is here present, and I am sure saw all that I have affirmed. Hereupon, the brother being sworn, he confirmed the above evidence in every particular, and the first witness added that having dipped his finger into what appeared to be blood, he felt satisfied that it was really so. It is to be observed that this extraordinary circumstance must have occurred, if it occurred at all, when the body had been upward of a month dead, for it was taken up in consequence of various rumors implicating the prisoners, after the coroner's jury had given in a verdict of felo de se. On their first trial they were acquitted, but an appeal being brought, they were found guilty and executed. It was on this latter occasion that the above strange evidence was given, which being taken down at the time by Sir John Maynard, then Sergeant at Law, stands recorded, as I have observed, in Hargrave's edition of State Trials. The above circumstances occurred in the year 1628, and in 1688 the blood ordeal was again had recourse to in the trial of Sir Philip Stansfield for parricide, on which occasion the body had also been buried, but for a short time. Certain suspicions arising, it was disinterred and examined by the surgeons, and from a variety of indications no doubt remained that the old man had been murdered, nor that his son was guilty of his death. When the body had been washed and arrayed in clean linen, the nearest relations and friends were desired to lift it and replace it in the coffin, and when Sir Philip placed his hand under it, he suddenly drew it back, stained with blood, exclaiming, "O God!" And letting the body fall, he cried, "Lord, have mercy on me," and went and bowed himself over a seat in the church in which the corpse had been inspected. Repeated testimonies are given to this circumstance in the course of the trial, and it is very remarkable that Sir John Dalrymple, a man of strong intellect and wholly free from superstition, admits it as an established fact in his charge to the jury. In short, we are all, though in different degrees, the subjects of a variety of subtle influences which more or less neutralize each other, and many of which, therefore, we never observe. And frequently, when we do observe the effects, we have neither time nor capacity for tracing the cause. And when in more susceptible organisms such effects are manifested, we content ourselves with referring to the phenomena to disease or imposture. The exemption or the power, whichever it may be, by which certain persons or races are enabled to handle venomous animals with impunity, is a subject that deserves much more attention than it has met with, but nobody thinks of investigating secrets that seem rather curious than profitable. Besides which, to believe these things implies a reflection on one's sagacity. Yet every now and then I hear of facts so extraordinary, which come to me from undoubted authority, that I can see no reason in the world for rejecting others that are not much more so. For example, only the other day, Mr. B.C., a gentleman well known in Scotland, who has lived a great deal abroad, informed me that having frequently heard of the singular phenomenon to be observed by placing a scorpion and a mouse together under a glass, he at length tried the experiment, and the result perfectly established what he had been previously unable to believe. Both animals were evidently frightened, but the scorpion made the first attack and stung the mouse, which defended itself bravely and killed the scorpion. The victory, however, was not without its penalties, for the mouse swelled to an unnatural size and seemed in danger of dying from the poison of its defeated antagonist, when it relieved itself and was cured by eating the scorpion, which was thus proved to be an antidote to its own venom, furnishing a most interesting and remarkable instance of isopathy. There is a religious sect in Africa, not far from Algiers, who eat the most venomous serpents alive, and certainly it is said without extracting their fangs. They declare they enjoy the privilege from their founder. The creatures writhe and struggle between their teeth, but possibly if they do bite them, the bite is innocuous. Then, not to mention the common expedients of extracting the poisonous fangs or forcing the animal by repeated bitings to exhaust their venom, the fact seems too well established to be longer doubted, that there are persons in whom the faculty of charming, or, in other words, disarming serpents, is inherent, as the Scylli and Marsi of old, and the people mentioned by Bruce, Hazequist, and Lempriere, who were themselves eyewitnesses of the facts they relate. With respect to the Marsi, it must be remembered that Heliogabalus made their priests fling venomous serpents into the circus when it was full of people, and that many perished by the bites of these animals, which the Marsi had handled with impunity. The modern charmers told Bruce that their immunity was born with them, and it was established beyond a doubt during the French expedition into Egypt, that these people go from house to house to destroy serpents, as men do rats in this country. They declare that some mysterious instinct guides them to the animals, which they immediately seize with fury and tear to pieces with their hands and teeth. The negroes of the Antilles can smell a serpent which they do not see, and of whose presence a European is quite insensible, and Madame Calderon de la Barca mentions in her letters from Mexico some singular cases of exemption from the pernicious effects of venomous bites, and further relates that in some parts of America, where rattlesnakes are extremely abundant, they have a custom of inoculating children with the poison, and that this is a preservative from future injury. This may or may not be true, but it is so much the fashion in these days to set down to the account of fable everything deviating from our daily experience, that travelers may repeat these stories for ages before any competent person will take the trouble of verifying the report. However, taking the evidence altogether, it appears clear that there does exist in some persons a faculty of producing in these animals a sort of numbness, or engourdissement, which renders them for the time incapable of mischief, though of the nature of the power we are utterly ignorant, unless it be magnetic. The senses of animals, although generally resembling ours, are yet extremely different in various instances, and we know that many of them have one faculty or another exalted to an intensity of which we have no precise conception. Galen asserted, on the authority of the Marsi and Scylli themselves, that they obtained their immunity by feeding on the flesh of venomous animals. But Pliny, Elian, Silius Italicus, and others account for the privilege by attributing it to the use of some substance of a powerful nature, with which they rubbed their bodies, and most modern travellers incline to the same explanation. But if this were the elucidation of the mystery, I suspect it would be easily detected. It is observable that in all countries where a secret of this sort exists, there is always found some custom which may be looked upon as either the cause or the consequence of the discovery. In Hindustan, for example, in order to test the truth of an accusation, the cobra capello is flung into a deep pot of earth with a ring, and if the supposed criminal succeeds in extracting the ring without being bitten by the serpent, he is accounted innocent. So the sacred asps in Egypt inflicted death upon the wicked, but spared the good. Dr. Allnut mentions that he saw a Negro in Africa touch the protruded tongue of a snake with the black matter from the end of his pipe, which he said was tobacco oil. The effects were as rapid as a shock of electricity. The animal never stirred again, but stiffened and was as rigid and hard as if it had been dried in the sun. It is related of Makamut, a Moorish king, that he fed on poisons till his bite became fatal and his saliva venomous. Chelius Rhodiginus mentions the same thing of a woman who was thus mortal to all her lovers. And Avicenna mentions a man whose bite was fatal in the same way. The boy that was found in the forest of Arden in 1563, and who had been nourished by a she-wolf, made a great deal of money for a short time after he was introduced to civilized life, by exempting the flocks and herds of the shepherds from the peril they nightly ran of being devoured by wolves. This he did by stroking them with his hands or wetting them with his saliva, after which they for some time enjoyed an immunity. His faculty was discovered from the circumstance of the beasts he kept never being attacked. It left him, however, when he was about 14, and the wolves ceased to distinguish him from other human beings. However, my readers will, I think, ere now have supped full with wonders, if not with horrors, and it is time I should bring this book to a conclusion. If I have done no more, I trust I shall at least have afforded some amusement, but I shall be better pleased to learn that I have induced any one, if it be but one, to look upon life and death and the mysteries that attach to both with a more curious and inquiring eye than they have hitherto done. I cannot but think that it would be a great step if mankind could familiarize themselves with the idea that they are spirits incorporated for a time in the flesh, but that the dissolution of the connection between soul and body, though it changes the external conditions of the former, leaves its mortal state unaltered. What a man has made himself he will be. His state is the result of his past life, and his heaven or hell is in himself. At death we enter upon a new course of life, and what that life shall be depends upon ourselves. If we have provided oil for our lamps, and fitted ourselves for a noble destiny in the fellowship of the great and good spirits that have passed away, such will be our portion. And if we have misused our talent, and sunk our souls in the sensual pleasures or base passions of this world, we shall carry our desires and passions with us, to make our torment in the other, or perhaps be tethered to the earth by some inextinguishable remorse or disappointed scheme, like those unhappy spirits I have been writing about, and that perhaps for hundreds of years, for although they be evidently freed from many of the laws of space and matter, while unable to leave the earth, they are still the children of time, and have not entered into eternity. It is surely absurd to expect that because our bodies have decayed and fallen away, or been destroyed by an accident, that a miracle is to be wrought in our favor, and that the miser's love of gold, or the profligate's love of vice, is to be immediately extinguished, and be superseded by inclinations and tastes better suited to his new condition. New circumstances do not so rapidly engender a new mind here, that we should hope they will do so there. More especially as, in the first place, we do not know what facilities of improvement may remain in us, and in the second, since the law that seeks like must be undeviating, the blind will seek the blind, and not those who could help them to light. I think, too, that if people would learn to remember that they are spirits, and acquire the habit of conceiving of themselves as individuals apart from the body, that they would not only be better able to realize this view of a future life, but they would also find it much less difficult to imagine that since they belong to the spiritual world on the one hand, quite as much as they belong to the material world on the other, that these extraordinary faculties, which they occasionally see manifested by certain individuals or in certain states, may possibly be but faint rays of those properties which are inherent in spirit, though temporarily obscured by its connection with the flesh, and designed to be so for the purposes of this earthly existence. The most ancient nations of the world knew this, although we have lost sight of it, as we learn by the sacred books of the Hebrews. According to the Kabbalah, mankind are endowed by nature not only with the faculty of penetrating into the regions of the supersensuous and invisible, but also of working magically above and below or in the worlds of light and darkness. As the Eternal fills the world, sees and is not seen, so does the soul, Nikkamik, fill the body, and sees without being seen. The soul perceives that which the bodily eye cannot. Sometimes a man is seized suddenly with a fear for which he cannot account, which is because the soul descries an impending misfortune. The soul possesses also the power of working with the elementary matter of the earth so as to annihilate one form and produce another. Even by the force of imagination human beings can injure other things, yea, even to the slaying of a man. The new Platonist, Paracelsus, says the same thing. The Kabbalah teaches that there have in all times existed men endowed with powers in a greater or less degree to work good or evil, for to be a virtuoso in either requires a peculiar spiritual vigor. Thence, such men as heroes and priests in the kingdom of Tuma, the kingdom of the clean and unclean. If a man therefore sets his desires on what is godly in proportion as his efforts are not selfish, but purely a seeking of holiness, he will be endowed by the free grace of God with supernatural faculties. And it is the highest aim of existence that man should regain his connection with his inward original source, and exalt the material and earthly into the spiritual. The highest degree of this condition of light and spirit is commonly called the holy ecstasy, which is apparently the degree attained by the ecstatics of the Tyrol. I am very far from meaning to imply that it is our duty, or in any way desirable, that we should seek to bring ourselves into this state of holy ecstasy, which seems to involve some derangement of the normal relations between the soul and body. But it is at least equally unwise in us to laugh at, or deny it, or its proximate conditions, where they really exist. It appears perfectly clear that as by giving ourselves up wholly to our external and sensuous life, we dim and obscure the Spirit of God that is in us, so by annihilating, as far as in us lies, the necessities of the body, we may so far subdue the flesh as to loosen the bonds of the spirit, and enable it to manifest some of its inherent endowments. Ascetics and saints have frequently done this voluntarily, and disease or a peculiar constitution sometimes does this for us involuntarily, and it is far from desirable that we should seek to produce such a state by either means. But it is extremely desirable that we should avail ourselves of the instruction to be gained by the simple knowledge that such phenomena have existed and been observed in all ages, and that thereby our connection with the spiritual world may become a demonstrated fact to all who choose to open their eyes to it. With regard to the cases of apparitions I have adduced, they are not, as I said before, 1/100th part of those I could have brought forward had I resorted to a few of the numerous printed collections that exist in all languages. Whether the view I acknowledged myself to take of the facts be or not the correct one, whether we are to look to the region of the psychical or the hyperphysical for the explanation, the facts themselves are certainly well worthy of observation, the more so as it will be seen that although ghosts are often said to be out of fashion, such occurrences are in reality as rife as ever. While if these shadowy forms be actually visitors from the dead, I think we cannot too soon lend an attentive ear to the tale their reappearance tells us. That we do not all see them, or that those who promise to come do not all keep tryst, amounts to nothing. We do not know why they can come, nor why they cannot. And as for not seeing them, I repeat, we must not forget how many other things there are that we do not see. And since in science we know that there are delicate manifestations which can only be rendered perceptible to our organs by the application of the most delicate electrometers, is it not reasonable to suppose that there may exist certain susceptible or diseased organisms which, judiciously handled, may serve as electrometers to the healthy ones? As my book is designed as an inquiry, with a note of interrogation, I characteristically bid adieu to my readers. C.C. End of section 27. Recording by Philip Gould. End of The Night Side of Nature, or Ghosts and Ghost-Seers by Catherine Crowe.